Section 1. The Show Beneath the Show. There is a version of The Simpsons that most people have never seen. Not because it was hidden, not because the episodes were pulled from broadcast or buried in a vault somewhere beneath Fox's offices. The version I'm talking about has been airing on television for 36 years. It's been sitting in plain sight the entire time, right there in the same time slot, inside the same opening credits sequence, behind the same couch gag that you've watched hundreds of times without thinking too hard about it. But when you settle into the right frame of mind, when the room gets quiet and the lights go low, and the noise of the day finally starts to soften at the edges, something happens to The Simpsons. The jokes don't land the same way. The music sounds different. The spaces between the punchlines start to feel longer, heavier, like they're holding something the show isn't quite saying out loud. What you're hearing in those spaces is the actual story. The Simpsons has always been two things simultaneously. On the surface, it is a comedy, one of the most successful and widely watched comedies in the history of American television. It is the show that made Sunday nights feel like a cultural event during the 1990s. It is the show that gave us Homer's signature scream of frustration, that gave us Bart's catchphrases, that gave us a version of the American family that was messy and imperfect, and somehow more honest than anything else on television at the time. It is the show that people quote at dinner tables and reference in political speeches and cite in academic papers about the nature of satire. It is woven into the fabric of American culture so completely that it is almost impossible to see anymore, the way you stop noticing the wallpaper in a room you've lived in your whole life. But underneath that comedy, underneath the gags and the guest stars and the couch gags, there is something else running, something quieter and considerably darker. A second story that the show has been telling for 3.5 decades in the language of tone and shadow and subtext, and the occasional episode that drops the comedic mask entirely and just looks at you, directly and without blinking, and says something true. Those are the episodes we're here for tonight. Not the horror anthology episodes, though we'll get to those. Not the parody episodes or the celebrity showcase episodes. The episodes that concern us are the ones that slip under your defenses, because they look like comedy right up until the moment they don't. The episodes built around loneliness, around grief, around the specific weight of a life that has gone sideways in ways too small to explain to anyone but too heavy to carry alone. The episodes where the jokes feel like a thin coat of paint over something raw underneath. These are the darkest Simpsons episodes, and we're going to spend the next 4 hours walking through them together. This is the kind of content that works best in the dark. If you're in bed already, good. If you're winding down from a long day and you just need something to fill the quiet without demanding too much from you, this is exactly the right place. The pacing here is slow and deliberate. There's no urgency, no countdown, no sudden loud moments designed to jolt you awake. Just the stories, told the way they deserve to be told, which is carefully and with full attention to everything the show was doing beneath the surface. Let's start at the beginning, because the beginning is not where most people think it is. The darkness in The Simpsons did not begin with some specific episode or some dramatic tonal shift in the writer's room. It was present from the very first episode, threaded into the premise itself, hiding in the gap between what the show looked like and what it actually was. The Simpsons debuted on December 17th, 1989. The first full episode was called Simpsons Roasting on an Open Fire, and its plot was deceptively simple. Homer discovers, at the last possible moment before Christmas, that he will not be receiving his annual bonus from Mr. Burns. Marge has already spent the family's emergency savings having Bart's tattoo removed. The family has no money for Christmas. Homer takes a job as a department store Santa Claus to make up the difference, earns almost nothing, and in a last-ditch effort, takes his small earnings to the dog track to bet on a long shot. The long shot loses. Homer is standing in the parking lot with nothing, the Christmas he promised his family dissolving around him, when a losing greyhound named Santa's Little Helper is thrown out by his owner for failing to win. Homer takes the dog home. The family accepts the dog as their Christmas gift. Everything is fine. Except look at what that story actually is when you strip away the warmth of the ending. It is the story of a man who cannot provide for his family. A man whose employer doesn't value him enough to give him a bonus that the man clearly was depending on. A man who is so desperate that he takes a humiliating second job and still fails, and then risks the little he has on a gamble because there are no other options. The emotional engine of the very first Simpsons episode is financial desperation, and the specific shame of a father who cannot give his children what they were expecting. The show wraps that engine in warmth and humor and a genuinely sweet ending. But the engine is still there, and once you notice it, you start to see it everywhere. Homer's relationship with his job has always been one of the show's darkest threads, running quietly beneath every episode that features the nuclear plant. He is not a man who chose his career. He is a man who ended up in Sector 7G the way most people end up in the jobs that define their lives, through a sequence of small decisions and limited options, and the gradual narrowing of possibility that happens when you start a family young and run out of room to change course. He works in a place that treats him as essentially invisible. His employer cannot remember his name after more than a decade of employment. The work itself is dangerous. The facility is crumbling. The safety protocols are maintained by Homer himself, which is the darkest joke the show ever committed to sustaining across 36 seasons. And Homer keeps showing up every morning because there's a mortgage on that house on Evergreen Terrace and 3 children who need things, and a wife who deserves better than the alternative, which is a Homer who doesn't show up. So he goes. And the show plays this for laughs, and the laughs are real, but underneath them is a portrait of working-class endurance that is about as bleak as American television has ever allowed itself to be. That is what we're studying tonight. Not the jokes, the truth inside the jokes. Before we go further, let me tell you what tonight's structure looks like, because we're going to cover a lot of ground and it helps to know where we're headed. We'll start with Homer's personal darkness, the episodes that focus specifically on the weight he carries and the moments when that weight became impossible to ignore. Then we'll move to the children, because Bart and Lisa and Maggie are not the simple archetypes they appear to be, and some of the show's most quietly devastating moments belong to them. After that, Marge. Then Burns and the institutional cruelty he represents. Then Springfield's forgotten characters, the ones who exist at the edges of the frame and occasionally step forward long enough to reveal something the show isn't supposed to say. The Treehouse of Horror episodes that crossed from horror comedy into something that felt genuinely uncomfortable. The episodes built around death and grief. The episodes that seemed to predict real-world darkness. And finally, the late-season episodes, the ones from the period when the show was supposed to have declined, that actually contain some of the most honest and difficult material in the entire run. 4 hours. 36 years of material. One yellow family in one impossible town, and every dark thing they ever quietly carried. Let's begin. The thing about watching The Simpsons at night, specifically, is that it changes the way your brain processes the show. During the day, with ambient noise and the general busyness of conscious life pulling at your attention, the comedy lands on the surface and you move on. But in the dark and the quiet, your mind slows down enough to hear the things underneath. The pauses become meaningful. The expressions on the characters' faces, which the animators rendered with far more emotional subtlety than most people ever noticed, start to communicate something the dialogue wasn't quite saying. There's a reason this show has inspired more serious academic analysis than almost any other piece of popular entertainment in American history. Not because it was trying to be art, exactly, though some of it clearly was, because it was honest, in the specific, indirect, heavily disguised way that only comedy allows. The Simpsons was honest about American life in a way that drama rarely manages, because drama announces its intentions and comedy sneaks past your defenses. The episodes we're discussing tonight are the ones where the honesty was loudest, where the disguise was thinnest, where the dark thing at the center of the show surfaced long enough to be seen clearly before the laugh track covered it over again. Get comfortable. Let the day go. We're going to Springfield and we're not coming back until morning. Before we go any further, drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is there. And if this is the kind of content that helps you wind down, subscribing is the way to make sure you never miss a night like this one. Number. Section 2. Homer's Descent. The episodes that showed a man breaking. Homer Simpson is funny. This is the foundational truth of the show, the premise upon which everything else is built. He is funny in the way that pratfalls are funny, in the way that a man confidently walking into a glass door is funny. His stupidity is rendered with such warmth and such specificity that it becomes endearing rather than tragic. We laugh at Homer the way we laugh at someone we love, who is also, unavoidably, a disaster. But there is a second Homer running beneath the comedic surface, and this Homer is considerably harder to spend time with. The second Homer is a man who knows, at some level, that the first Homer is too dim to access directly, that his life did not go the way it was supposed to. He is a man who was once something closer to capable, whose potential was stunted by a combination of circumstance and damage, and the specific kind of resignation that settles into a person when they stop believing the future will be different from the present. He is a man who loves his family with a totality that his brain cannot fully express, who experiences emotions that are too large and too complicated for his limited cognitive architecture to process cleanly, who consequently expresses everything as either appetite or frustration or occasional bursts of inexplicable joy. The episodes that reveal this Homer are the ones we're starting with tonight, because they are the foundation for understanding everything else the show was doing in its darker registers. Homer vs. Patty and Selma Season 6, Episode 17. This episode is rarely included in lists of the show's most memorable installments. It doesn't have a famous catchphrase attached to it. It doesn't feature a guest star whose appearance became a cultural moment. It is a quiet episode about a quiet shame, and for that reason, it might be the most honest 22 minutes the show ever produced about the specific experience of financial failure. The premise is straightforward in the way that the show's best premises always are. Homer has made a series of bad investments, the details of which the episode breezes past because the details don't matter. What matters is the result. Homer is in debt. Not catastrophically, not in the way that ends with losing the house or the children going hungry, but in a way that requires him to borrow money, and the only people willing to lend it to him are Marge's sisters, Patty and Selma. Patty and Selma despise Homer. This has been established across the entire run of the show. They have never believed he was good enough for their sister. They have made this belief known through years of constant, low-level contempt. And Homer knows this about them, the way he knows most things, which is in his bones rather than his brain, in the form of a physical discomfort that he cannot always articulate but can never entirely escape. Borrowing money from Patty and Selma is the single most humiliating thing Homer could be asked to do, short of a small number of scenarios that the show's writing staff found too dark to commit to paper, and Homer does it. He goes to their apartment, he asks, and Patty and Selma, with the specific cruelty of people who have been waiting for this moment for years, agree to lend him the money on terms that include his complete submission to their authority at work, because they have since gotten jobs at the DMV where Homer also works, and the arrangement means Homer must spend his working hours being managed by two women who consider him barely worth managing. What makes this episode dark in a way that sneaks up on you is not the humiliation itself, which the show plays for laughs in the standard mode. It is the scene where Homer and Marge are alone in the bedroom at night, and Homer is confessing what he's done. He has been hiding the debt from Marge. He has been hiding the arrangement with her sisters. He has been going to work every day and accepting Patty and Selma's treatment because telling Marge would mean admitting that he failed, and failing in front of Marge is something Homer Simpson simply cannot do. The scene is played softly. There's no big dramatic confrontation. Marge is not furious exactly. She is tired. She is the particular tired that comes from loving someone who keeps landing you both in situations like this, and she loves him anyway, and the love and the tiredness coexist in her face with a complexity that the animators captured with remarkable precision. Homer's voice in that scene is smaller than it usually is. The bravado is gone. What's left is a man who borrowed money from people he despises because he didn't want to disappoint his wife, and the borrowing has disappointed her anyway, and there is no version of this story where he comes out clean. The episode resolves happily, as Simpsons episodes almost invariably do. Homer finds a way to pay back the debt. Patty and Selma's hold over him is broken. Everything goes back to normal. But that bedroom scene lingers in a way the happy ending doesn't quite erase. Because the bedroom scene was true in a way the happy ending isn't quite. Saturdays of Thunder Season 3, Episode 9. This is an earlier episode, and on its surface it is a simple comedy about father-son bonding and soapbox racing. But threading through the comedy is a portrait of Homer's relationship with fatherhood that is genuinely difficult to sit with if you're paying the right kind of attention. The episode begins with Homer taking a quiz from a parenting magazine and discovering that he cannot answer a single question about his son's life. He doesn't know Bart's favorite food or his best friend or what he wants to be when he grows up. He knows nothing. And the show plays this as comedy, which it is, but it is also a man confronting the fact that he has been so absorbed in his own experience of being alive that he has failed to actually see one of the people he loves most. Homer's response to this discovery is the heart of the episode. He decides to be more present for Bart. He involves himself in Bart's soapbox derby project. The involvement is, initially, catastrophic, because Homer's skills at this kind of practical project are essentially non-existent. But he keeps trying. He keeps showing up. And the scene where Homer finally manages to help Bart build something that actually works, sitting on the garage floor surrounded by tools he barely knows how to use, both of them covered in grease and laughing at some small shared joke, is the kind of scene that The Simpsons could do better than almost any other show on television when it was working at its best. The darkness in this episode comes from what the quiz represents. Homer is not a bad father in the way that cartoonishly bad TV fathers are bad. He is not cruel or absent or indifferent in any active sense. He loves Bart completely and without reservation. But the love has not translated into attention, and for most of Bart's life up to this point, Homer has been present in the house without being present in the relationship. The quiz is a mirror, and Homer doesn't like what he sees in it. And what makes the episode quietly devastating rather than just comedically embarrassing is that Homer's response to the mirror is not to argue with it. He doesn't rationalize. He doesn't explain his failures away. He just quietly decides to do something about it, which is perhaps the most emotionally intelligent thing Homer Simpson ever does in the show's entire run. And he does it without fanfare, without being told to, without anyone asking him to. That's the Homer who lives underneath the comedy. The Homer who occasionally looks up from his own life long enough to see that something needs to be different, and who responds to that vision with something that looks a lot like grace. King Size Homer, Season 7, Episode 7. This is the episode where Homer deliberately gains weight in order to qualify as disabled so that he can work from home, and it is one of the show's funniest half hours by almost any measure. The physical comedy is spectacular. The plotting is inventive. Homer in a muumuu is an image that lodged itself in the cultural memory of an entire generation. But watch this episode at 2 in the morning with the sound low and let yourself settle into what it's actually about, and something shifts. Homer's plan works. He gains the weight, he gets to stay home, and the episode shows what Homer's days look like when he is released from the obligation of going to the plant. He watches television. He eats. He watches more television. He develops an elaborate system for not having to get off the couch to change the channel that involves a mop handle and a fishing rod. When he is finally required to interact with the computer that has been installed in his home for work purposes, he does so with the absolute minimum of engagement, eventually setting the machine to press a single key on repeat to simulate ongoing activity while he sleeps. This is played as pure comedy, and it is funny. But it is also a portrait of a man who, when given complete freedom, fills that freedom with almost nothing. Homer's fantasy of staying home is the fantasy of not being required to be anything, and when it's fulfilled, what it reveals is a kind of emptiness that the constant requirement of showing up had been covering. The episode redeems itself comedically when Homer is forced to actually prevent a nuclear meltdown by swimming out to the plant, and the buoyancy generated by his extra body mass makes him accidentally heroic. The ending is warm, Homer is appreciated, everything is fine. But the middle section, those quiet scenes of Homer alone in his house with nothing he wants to do and nothing required of him, contains something true and uncomfortable about what happens to people when the structure of obligation is removed and there's nothing underneath it to fill the space. And Maggie makes 3 Season 6, Episode 13. This is the episode told in flashback, the story of how Maggie came to be. Homer had saved enough money to quit the plant and pursue his dream of working at a bowling alley. He was genuinely, visibly happy in a way the show rarely allowed him to be. And then Marge became pregnant with a 3rd child, and the bowling alley job couldn't support a family of 5, and Homer had to go back to Burns and beg for his old job back. Burns makes Homer beg, fully, completely, on his knees beg, and then gives him his job back with a plaque installed at his workstation that reads, "Don't forget, you're here forever." The episode's ending is one of the most famous in the show's history. Homer has covered this plaque with photographs of Maggie arranged so that the message reads, "Do it for her." It is genuinely moving. It transforms the plaque from a symbol of Homer's defeat into a symbol of his love. But the plaque is still there. Under all those photographs, the words are still there. Homer has not been liberated from his situation. He has not found a way to want something different from what he has. He has simply found a way to make what he has bearable by placing the image of his daughter in front of the parts that hurt. He goes to that plant every day. He sits under that plaque every day. And every day he looks at Maggie's face and decides that the trade was worth it. There is profound love in that ending. But there is also profound resignation, and in the dark and the quiet, the two things are almost impossible to separate. Homer the Great Season 6, Episode 12. This episode is mostly remembered for the Stonecutters, the secret society that Homer joins, and the song, which is genuinely one of the show's great comedic set pieces. But the episode's architecture is a story about belonging and exclusion that runs much darker than the comedy suggests. Homer discovers that almost everyone he knows is a member of a secret fraternal organization called the Stonecutters, and that he has been excluded his entire life. The exclusion is not malicious, exactly. It is simply the way these things work. Homer was not invited. Nobody thought to invite him. And the discovery that this parallel world of fellowship and shared ritual has existed around him for his entire adult life, completely invisible to him, produces in Homer a loneliness that the show renders with surprising accuracy. The scene where Homer first enters the Stonecutters meeting hall and sees his friends and neighbors and coworkers seated together in a space built specifically for belonging is one of the show's most quietly sad images, because Homer's face in that scene is the face of a man who has just understood something about his place in the world that he would rather not have understood. He gets in, eventually. The episode becomes funny again. Homer becomes the prophesied chosen one, and the comedy runs from there. But the loneliness in that earlier scene is real, and it doesn't quite go away. Missionary Impossible Season 11, Episode 15, Homer, fleeing from PBS telethon operators he has stiffed on a pledge, ends up being sent to a remote Pacific island as a missionary. The episode is a comedy, and a fairly broad one, but it contains a thread about Homer's relationship with his own life that is worth following carefully. Stranded on the island with no beer, no television, no family, no donuts, no plant, and none of the 1,000 small stimulations that normally fill his days, Homer is forced to confront what he actually is when all of it is removed. And what he finds is not nothing, which might be the most optimistic thing the episode does. He builds something. He connects with people. He makes something with his hands that serves a community. The darkness is in the implication. Homer is happier and more functional on this remote island, stripped of everything that constitutes his actual life, than he is in Springfield. The life he has built, or that has been built around him, is not one that serves him particularly well. And he knows this, and he goes back to it anyway, because the alternative is not a real alternative. It is a fantasy, and fantasies don't come with mortgages. The Dad Who Knew Too Little and the episodes like it. There is a category of Homer episode that could be called the accountability episodes, where Homer does something genuinely harmful to one of his children and is then required to sit with the consequences of that harm for long enough that it stops being comfortable. These episodes are not the most famous in the show's run, but they are some of its most honest. In these episodes, Homer is not simply incompetent in a harmless way. He makes choices that hurt his kids. He prioritizes his own comfort or ego or appetites over their needs. He says things in moments of frustration that land harder than he intended. He fails them in the particular way that parents fail their children, not through malice but through the simple, overwhelming presence of their own inner life, which crowds out the ability to fully see and respond to another person's need. The show almost always brings Homer back around. He recognizes what he's done. He tries to fix it. The relationship is repaired. But in the middle sections of these episodes, before the repair, there is something genuinely uncomfortable about watching Homer's failures land on the faces of his children, because the children's pain is rendered with the same precision and care as everything else in the show, and it does not look like comedy. Lisa's face when Homer dismisses something she cares about. Bart's face when he realizes his father isn't paying attention in the specific moment when attention was everything. These images accumulate across 36 seasons into a portrait of imperfect fatherhood that is more honest than almost anything on American television has managed to be, because it doesn't let Homer off the hook entirely while also refusing to reduce him to a villain. He loves them. He fails them. He loves them. He fails them again. He loves them through the failure and despite it and because of it. And the loop continues, because that is what loops do in Springfield. And that is what families do everywhere. Deep Space Homer Season 5, Episode 15. Homer goes to space in this episode, which is remembered primarily as a showcase for spectacle and absurdist comedy. But the episode's setup is a quieter story about invisibility. Homer is not selected to be an astronaut because of any merit. He is selected because NASA needs a ratings boost and has determined that an average, unremarkable American everyman will attract more viewers than a qualified candidate. Homer is chosen specifically because he represents the median of American mediocrity. He is the demographic, the baseline, the person against whom the ideal is measured by showing how far from it Homer falls. Homer is so excited to be selected that he doesn't fully process what the selection means about how he is perceived. He is being used. His ordinariness is a commodity. And the moment where this might dawn on him, where he might look at the reason for his selection and feel the complicated feelings that reason should produce, the show speeds past it into the next comedic set piece. But in the dark, that moment sits in the air a little longer. A man is chosen for the greatest adventure of his life, specifically because everyone agrees he represents the lowest common denominator. And he is so starved for recognition that he takes it, gratefully and without reservation. The episode is a comedy. It is a very good comedy, but the premise is one of the darker things the show ever quietly did to its central character, and the fact that Homer is too limited to feel the intended wound is both the joke and the tragedy simultaneously. The Homer episodes we've covered here are not the only dark Homer episodes in the show's run. They are a selection, a sampling meant to illustrate the secondary story that runs through all of them. Homer Simpson is funny. Homer Simpson is also a man who has been running for 36 years, slightly below the surface of his own life, close enough to love his family fully, but just far enough underwater that he cannot quite see clearly the architecture of the situation he is living inside. The comedy is the distance between what Homer could understand and what he actually does understand. And the darkness is everything that exists in that distance, patient and permanent and never quite resolved. Number Section 3. The children who were never really children. Bart Simpson is 10 years old. He has been 10 years old for 36 years. In that time, he has experienced more loss, more failure, more humiliation, more genuine psychological damage than most adult television characters encounter across a full dramatic series arc. The show presents his experiences as comedy, and many of them are, but the cumulative picture is of a child who has been failed in ways that the comedy keeps us from examining too closely. Lisa Simpson is 8 years old. She is the most intellectually capable person in Springfield by a significant margin. She is also, and this is the detail that the show returns to, constantly, utterly alone. Her intelligence is not a gift the show allows her to enjoy. It is a burden she carries through every episode, the specific burden of seeing clearly in a community that has organized itself around not seeing. Maggie Simpson is 1 year old. She has been 1 year old for 36 years. She does not speak, she watches, and what she has watched, across 3.5 decades of silent observation, is enough to explain why she hasn't yet decided it's worth joining the conversation. The children of the Simpson family are not simple characters. They are among the most psychologically complex figures in the show's universe, and some of the darkest material in the show's entire run belongs to them. Bart the General Season 1, Episode 5. This is an early episode, from the first season, when the show was still figuring out what it was, and it is remarkable for how directly it engages with the reality of childhood violence. Bart is being bullied by Nelson Muntz. The bullying is physical and consistent and severe enough that Bart is genuinely afraid to go to school. He tries various strategies to deal with the situation, enlisting the help of Grandpa and eventually organizing a counter-offensive with the neighborhood kids that ends the bullying through force. The episode is played as a military comedy, and it is funny in that mode. But strip away the comedic framing, and what you have is a child who is being harmed on a regular basis by another child, who is afraid, who cannot rely on the adults in his life to protect him, and who ultimately must resolve the situation through violence, because no other option is made available to him. The adults in Bart's life in this episode are characteristically useless. Homer, when consulted, gives advice that is both wrong and harmful. The school does nothing. The solution Bart arrives at is one he has to engineer himself, at 10 years old, because the systems that should protect him have failed to do so. This pattern, Bart identifying a problem, finding adult support unavailable or inadequate, and solving the problem himself through some combination of cleverness and recklessness, recurs throughout the show's run. It is presented as a character strength, which it is, but it is also the portrait of a child who learned very early that he could not rely on the structures that were supposed to be there for him, and who adapted accordingly. That adaptation has costs that the comedy never fully accounts for. Bart gets an F Season 2. Episode 1. This is one of the show's genuinely great episodes, and it is great in part because it takes Bart's academic struggles completely seriously in a way that the show's comedy often doesn't. Bart is failing. Not in the casual, harmless way that the show usually presents his academic underperformance, but in a way that has real consequences attached to it. He is going to be held back a year. He is going to repeat the fourth grade while his classmates move on, and the social humiliation of this outcome is something Bart understands completely and fears genuinely. The episode follows Bart through a cycle of avoidance and procrastination and last-minute panic that is rendered with uncomfortable accuracy. The scene where he is finally studying, genuinely trying for the first time in what the episode implies is his entire academic career, sitting alone at his desk late at night while the rest of the house sleeps, is one of the show's most precisely observed pieces of animation. He is struggling. The material doesn't come easily to him. He tries different approaches, he writes things down, he reads them back, he tries again. He still fails the test. And what happens next is the scene that makes this episode essential viewing for anyone interested in what The Simpsons was capable of at its best. Bart sits with his failed test in Mrs. Krabappel's classroom, and he begins to cry. Not the comedic crying of a character being humiliated for laughs. Real crying. The kind that comes from genuine effort that came to nothing. From trying and failing in a way that feels like evidence of something fundamental and terrible about yourself. And then, through his tears, Bart notices something outside the window. Snow. Unprecedented December snow in Springfield. And because he knows the history he was supposed to have studied, because something went in during those late-night hours, even if it wasn't quite enough, he is able to explain to Mrs. Krabappel that this kind of weather anomaly occurred only once before in Springfield's history, on a specific date in 1850, and the historical knowledge earns him 1 extra point and a passing grade. Bart is so relieved that he hugs Mrs. Krabappel. And Mrs. Krabappel, who is not a warm woman, who is not a character the show generally uses for warmth, hugs him back, because she has been watching a child genuinely struggle and genuinely try. And she recognizes what that took. The episode ends happily, but the path to that ending is one of the most honest depictions of academic struggle and the specific shame of it that American television had produced to that point. Bart's experience in this episode is not played for laughs. It is played for truth, and the truth is uncomfortable enough to earn the warmth of the ending. Bart sells his Soul Season 7, Episode 4. This is a philosophical episode, and an unusual one, in that it takes completely seriously the question of whether Bart Simpson has a soul and what the loss of that soul means. Bart, in a cynical moment, sells his soul to Milhouse for $5. The transaction is meant as a joke, a prank, a casual act of irreverence toward a concept Bart dismisses as superstition, but as the episode progresses, something begins to go wrong. Bart notices that he can't seem to feel things the way he used to. Automatic doors don't open for him. Animals don't respond to him. He is unable to laugh at a comedy film that he knows is funny, sitting in the theater with the knowledge that this should be making him laugh and the inexplicable inability to do so. The episode operates on 2 levels simultaneously. On the surface, it is a comic fantasy, playing with the mythology of soul selling in a playful and self-aware way. But underneath it is a story about a child who has lost access to something essential in himself and doesn't quite know how to name what's missing or how to get it back. The scene where Bart, unable to sleep, goes to the window and whispers into the night, addressing the soul he sold, asking it to come back, is one of the most unexpectedly moving scenes in the show's history. There is nothing comedic about it. Bart is alone, in the dark, reaching out towards something he cannot see or touch and whose absence he feels as a kind of cold that no temperature can account for. He is 10 years old and he is having what can only be described as a spiritual crisis, and nobody in the house is awake to help him with it. Lisa finds his soul and buys it back for him. The episode ends warmly, but that night scene belongs to the second story, the dark one, and it doesn't quite leave you when the comedy resumes. Stark Raving Dad Season 3, Episode 1. This episode is famous primarily for featuring Michael Jackson performing as a large white man named Leon Kompowski, who Homer meets in a psychiatric facility. The Michael Jackson connection has made the episode controversial in ways that have changed its availability, but the episode itself is worth discussing independent of that controversy because the story it's actually telling is about Lisa. The episode's central conflict, beneath the Leon Kompowski material, is Lisa's birthday. Bart has forgotten it. Not in the way that suggests he doesn't care about Lisa, but in the way that suggests Bart's mind is elsewhere, and Lisa's feelings are, in this instance, not the thing he is focused on. Lisa has been preparing herself for a birthday celebration that will finally acknowledge her in the way she is always hoping to be acknowledged, and Bart's forgetting is the last in what the episode implies is a long series of similar disappointments. The song that Leon and Bart perform for Lisa's birthday is performed beautifully, and Lisa receives it with overwhelming gratitude, which is itself a little heartbreaking. She is so hungry for acknowledgement that a birthday song assembled at the last minute by her brother and a stranger in her father's clothes is enough to reduce her to tears of joy. The darkness in this episode is in the degree of Lisa's need. She doesn't want much. She wants to be seen. She wants someone to have thought about her enough to do something specifically for her. And the show has established, by this point in its run, that this need goes largely unmet on a regular basis. The birthday song is moving because the bar for what moves Lisa is so low, and the bar is so low because the show has quietly been showing us that low bar being justified across 2.5 seasons. Lisa's Substitute Season 2, Episode 19. This is the episode that made the case, definitively, that The Simpsons was capable of breaking your heart without apology. Lisa develops a deep attachment to a substitute teacher named Mr. Bergstrom, who is the first adult outside her family who has ever treated her intelligence as something worth celebrating rather than accommodating or tolerating. He sees her. He takes her seriously. He talks to her as though her thoughts and feelings and ideas are worth engaging with rather than managing. Lisa falls in love with him in the way that children fall in love with the first person who fully sees them. It is not romantic. It is something more fundamental. It is the recognition love, the love that says you are exactly who you think you are, and that matters. And then Mr. Bergstrom has to leave, because he is a substitute and his assignment ends. And Lisa, facing the loss of the one adult who has ever treated her as a full person, goes to the train station to say goodbye. The scene at the train station is the scene. It is what this episode is remembered for and what it deserves to be remembered for. Lisa asks Mr. Bergstrom what she should do when she misses him, when she needs someone who understands her and he's not there. And Mr. Bergstrom writes something on a piece of paper and gives it to her. And when Lisa opens the paper, it reads, "You are Lisa Simpson." That's it. That's the whole message. You are Lisa Simpson. And it is the most complete and devastating thing the show ever said about this character, because the message is not a comfort exactly. It is a statement of fact that contains both the weight of her isolation and the seed of her resilience. She is Lisa Simpson. She is alone in the specific way that Lisa Simpson is alone. And she has to be enough for herself because Mr. Bergstrom is getting on the train and Springfield is not a place where Lisa Simpsons thrive. Lisa goes home. She finds Homer in the kitchen. She climbs into his lap and cries, and Homer, who does not understand what she is crying about, who cannot follow the emotional logic of her loss, holds her. He doesn't try to fix it. He doesn't minimize it. He just holds her. Because somewhere beneath the comedy and the limited cognition and the 1,000 small failures of attentiveness, Homer Simpson knows what it means to need someone, and he responds to that need the best way he can. The episode ends there. No resolution, no cheerful coda, just a father holding a daughter who is heartbroken in a kitchen in Springfield, while the show holds steady on that image long enough to let it breathe. Separate Vocations Season 3, Episode 18. This episode does something structurally unusual for the show. It reverses Bart and Lisa. Bart takes a career aptitude test and discovers he might be well suited to law enforcement. Lisa takes the same test and discovers that her physical limitations make her unlikely to pursue the career in music she has always dreamed of. Lisa's response to this information is to abandon her good behavior entirely. She becomes a rebel. She skips class. She hides textbooks. She acts out. And the show presents this as comic reversal, which it partly is, but it also presents it as the logical response of an 8-year-old who has just been told that the one thing she has built her identity around is unlikely to work out for her. What's dark about this episode is what Lisa's rebellion reveals about her normal behavior. Lisa is good, obedient, academically excellent, and socially responsible, not because these things come naturally to her or because she doesn't feel the pull of rebellion, but because she has constructed her identity around the belief that her intelligence and her discipline and her goodness will eventually get her somewhere. Strip that belief away, and the behavior it was sustaining goes with it. Bart's response to the career aptitude test is warm and funny. His brief stint as a hall monitor is one of the episode's comedic highlights. But Lisa's arc is the one that lingers, because it shows us the structural vulnerability at the core of her character. She is holding herself together through conviction and effort, and the conviction depends on a future that is not guaranteed. Maggie's long dark night of no one noticing. There is no single Maggie episode in this section because Maggie's darkness is distributed differently from Bart and Lisa's. It doesn't manifest in specific crisis episodes. It manifests in the accumulation of her silence across the show's entire run. Maggie Simpson has been awake, alert, observant, and fundamentally unseen for 36 years. She is present at virtually every major family event. She witnesses every crisis, every moment of dysfunction, every small and large failure of her parents and her siblings to see each other clearly. She takes in all of it with those enormous, steady eyes, and she says nothing. The darkness of Maggie is the darkness of the witness. She knows things. She has seen things. She understands the architecture of her family's struggles with a clarity that none of the other characters possess, and she cannot share what she knows because she has determined, through careful observation of what happens to people who do share what they know in Springfield, that silence is the safer option. Watch any episode where Maggie is in the room during a family conflict. Watch her eyes. The animators gave her a specific quality of attention that the other characters don't have. A stillness and a focus that reads as something very close to adult comprehension. She is not confused by what she's watching. She understands it. She is choosing what to do with what she understands, and she is consistently choosing to hold it. That is its own kind of weight. The weight of knowing and not speaking. The weight of witnessing without the ability to intervene. Maggie carries that weight at 1 year old, which she has been carrying for 36 years, and the show has never quite given her the space to put it down. The kids overall, what the show said about childhood? The Simpsons children are not a message about childhood in general. They are a specific and detailed portrait of the experience of growing up in a family that loves you completely and is simultaneously unable to give you everything you need. Bart needed stability and consistent boundaries, and a sense that failure had consequences beyond embarrassment. He needed the specific kind of attention that says, what you do matters, not just what you are. He got love, abundant and genuine, but the stability was intermittent, and the consequences were always negotiable, and the message about mattering got lost in the noise. Lisa needed to be seen. She needed the world around her to be capable of receiving what she had to offer, or at least to acknowledge it as worth something. She got love, the same abundant and genuine love that Bart got, but she was surrounded by a community incapable of seeing her, and the love didn't bridge the gap between who she was and what Springfield could accommodate. Maggie needed something the show never fully specified, which might be why her story is the least resolved. She needed room to become something, and the show, by freezing her permanently at 1 year old, by refusing to allow the timeline to move, has ensured that the space she needs to grow into has never appeared. The three of them together constitute a portrait of the specific way in which good intentions and genuine love can still produce damaged outcomes, not because of malice or neglect, but because people are limited and situations are complicated, and the gap between what a child needs and what a parent can provide is sometimes insurmountable, regardless of how much love exists on both sides of it. The show never says this directly. It says it in the accumulation of episodes like the ones we've discussed, in the slow build of evidence across 36 seasons, in the texture of expressions and pauses and small moments between the jokes where the truth of the thing surfaces briefly before the comedy covers it over again. Springfield's children are doing their best. Their parents are doing their best. The distance between those two bests is where the darkness lives. Number Section 4. Marge's quiet suffering. The episodes nobody talks about. Marge Simpson is the character the show has most consistently underestimated, both within the fictional world of Springfield and in the cultural conversation about the show itself. The discourse about The Simpsons focuses on Homer's failures and Bart's antics and Lisa's intelligence and Burns's villainy. Marge is the background, the constant, the patient center that holds everything else in place. But Marge has a story. A dark and complicated and largely untold story about a woman who gave up a version of herself to become the person her family needed, and who has been quietly, persistently, and very nearly silently paying the cost of that trade for 3.5 decades. The Marge episodes are the ones that most consistently blindside viewers, because the show has trained us to expect certain things from Marge, and then occasionally, with no warning, delivers something entirely different. Marge versus the Monorail Season 4, Episode 12. This episode is remembered primarily as a comedy classic, one of Conan O'Brien's contributions to the show's golden era, and it is a comedy classic. The Monorail Salesman is a spectacular comedic creation. The song is sublime. The episode moves with the energy and confidence of a show operating at the height of its powers. But watch the episode with your attention on Marge, and a different story emerges. Marge is the only person in Springfield who is skeptical of the monorail from the beginning. She does the research. She asks the questions. She drives to North Haverbrook and sees the ruins that the monorail left behind the last time this salesman sold his scheme to a town. She comes back with evidence. She presents that evidence to the town meeting. And nobody listens. The town bought the monorail before Marge got back. The decision was made, her research was irrelevant. The fact that she was right about everything, that she had done exactly what a responsible citizen in possession of all her faculties should do in this situation, changed nothing about the outcome. This is Marge's experience in Springfield rendered in its purest form. She sees clearly, she acts on what she sees, she is ignored. The community proceeds with the wrong decision anyway. And then, when the monorail nearly kills everyone, Homer is the one who saves the day through luck and improvisation, and the episode ends with the town moving on, and nobody particularly crediting Marge with having been correct about all of it from the beginning. Marge is always right. Marge is never listened to. This pattern runs through the show's entire history, and it is so consistent that it stops being an observation about one character and becomes a thesis statement about the nature of the community she lives in. Scenes from the class struggle in Springfield Season 7, Episode 14. This is the episode where Marge acquires an expensive designer suit at a discount price and begins to move in the social circles of Springfield's upper class. The episode is a class comedy, satirizing both the snobbery of the wealthy and the desperation of the aspirational, and it works well in that mode. But the emotional center of the episode is Marge's relationship with who she is versus who she thinks she should be. Marge in this episode discovers that she is capable of passing in circles that she previously had no access to. She can hold a conversation with wealthy people. She can navigate their social codes. She is, when given the chance, someone who fits into a world considerably more sophisticated than the one she normally inhabits. And this discovery is not entirely pleasant, because it raises questions about the choices she has made and the life those choices have produced. The episode handles this with some delicacy and ultimately comes down on the side of Marge accepting and embracing who she is rather than who she might have been under different circumstances. But before that resolution, there is a Marge who is briefly visible, one who looks at an alternative version of her life and feels the pull of it in a way that is recognizable and complicated and not entirely resolved by the episode's cheerful ending. Marge married Homer when she was young. She made that choice with full awareness and genuine love, and she has never, in the show's entire run, been presented as regretting it. But the show occasionally surfaces the question of what other lives might have existed for her, and in those moments, it acknowledges that Marge is a person of considerable depth and capability who has organized the expression of that depth and capability almost entirely around the needs of others. Marge on the Lam Season 5, Episode 6. Marge befriends her neighbor Ruth Powers in this episode, and they spend an evening together, just the two of them, doing things that do not serve any other member of the household. They go to a concert, they drive fast, they feel, briefly, like people who exist independent of their domestic roles. The darkness in this episode is in how unusual that experience is for Marge. It is presented as an adventure, which is the show's way of acknowledging that it is exceptional rather than normal. Marge having an evening to herself is significant enough to constitute an episode's premise. That says something about what her ordinary evenings look like. The episode also introduces Ruth Powers as a character who has made a different set of choices from Marge, including leaving her marriage, and the show treats Ruth with sympathy rather than judgment, which was not universal in the early 90s and reflects something generous in the writer's room at that time. Ruth's choices are not presented as mistakes. They are presented as choices, made by a person with reasons for making them, and Marge's friendship with Ruth is presented as a genuine meeting of two adults rather than a cautionary tale. Marge Be Not Proud Season 7, Episode 11. This episode, ostensibly a Bart episode about shoplifting, is actually a Marge episode about the specific fear of losing a child's trust in you as a mother. Bart shoplifts a video game. He is caught. Marge finds out. And Marge's response is not anger exactly, it is something closer to grief. Grief at the gap that the shoplifting reveals between the child she thought she was raising and the choices that child is apparently capable of making. Grief at the possibility that she has somehow failed to communicate something important. Grief that is expressed in the show's characteristic way, which is through withdrawal rather than confrontation. Marge goes cold. Not cruelly cold, not deliberately punishing cold. The particular cold of a person who is too hurt to be warm and too disciplined to be cruel. She creates distance between herself and Bart in a way that Bart experiences as something very close to being cut off from the person he needs most. The scene where Bart tries to reconnect with Marge and she responds with a politeness that is worse than anger, that is, the functional performance of caring without the warmth that makes caring feel like caring, is one of the show's most precisely observed pieces of emotional writing. Marge is not being cruel. She is being honest, in the way that withdrawal is honest. She is telling Bart, without words, that something has changed, and she cannot pretend it hasn't. The episode resolves. Bart demonstrates that he has understood the lesson. Marge's warmth returns. But the coldness in the middle of the episode is real, and it is a kind of real that the show rarely allowed itself to depict. Marge gets a job season 4, episode 7. Marge takes a job at the nuclear plant and is almost immediately subjected to workplace harassment from Mr. Burns, who falls in love with her in the particular obsessive way that powerful men in positions of authority fall in love with people who work for them and who have no safe way to refuse their attention. The episode plays this as comedy, which it partly is. Burns's infatuation is absurd, and his methods are cartoonish, and the resolution comes through Homer, rather than through any action Marge takes on her own behalf. But the experience Marge goes through in this episode, the experience of having a powerful man use his institutional authority to make his personal obsession her professional problem, is not abstract. It is specific and it is correctly observed, and the comedy doesn't quite succeed in covering the discomfort of watching a character we care about be placed in a position where she has essentially no good options. Marge does not confront Burns. She cannot because the power differential is too extreme. She does not escalate. She manages, and she manages in the particular way that people manage when the system they are working within has no mechanism for addressing what is being done to them. She waits for the situation to resolve itself, and it does, but through luck rather than justice. The strong arms of the Ma Season 14, Episode 9, Marge, following a traumatic experience in which she is robbed and physically threatened, becomes so anxious that she refuses to leave the house. The agoraphobia is treated with some comedic license, but the episode takes the underlying experience seriously enough to be worth discussing in this context. Marge eventually finds a way to manage her anxiety through weightlifting, which gives her a sense of physical capability and control. This part of the episode is genuinely warm, and the transformation is satisfying in a way that feels earned. But the episode then complicates the transformation by allowing it to go too far. Marge becomes aggressive. She overcorrects. The strength she has built to protect herself becomes something she uses in ways that are harmful, and the episode has to walk back the empowerment narrative it spent 20 minutes building. This is the show being complicated in a way it doesn't always choose to be. Marge's response to trauma is not wrong. Building strength and capability in response to a frightening experience is entirely rational. But the show refuses to let her transformation be simple, which is honest even if it's uncomfortable, because recovery is almost never simple. And the skills you develop to survive one situation don't always translate cleanly to the next one. Marge in Chains Season 4, Episode 21. Marge goes to prison in this episode after being accused of shoplifting something she genuinely forgot she had taken. The comedy is there, and it is adequate comedy. But the episode's darker layer is about what happens to a family when the person who manages everything is suddenly unavailable. Without Marge, the household falls apart in ways that are funny in the show's characteristic mode, but that also reveal how completely the functioning of the Simpson household depends on her constant, largely invisible management. Homer cannot keep the house clean. He cannot prepare adequate food. He cannot maintain the children's routines or their emotional stability or any of the 100 small things that Marge does every day without being thanked for or, in most cases, even noticed. The revelation of what Marge does by showing what happens in her absence is a classic comedic device, but it also constitutes an acknowledgement of something that the show usually keeps in the background. Marge is working. All the time, every day, constantly, and almost none of it is recognized as work because it happens in a domestic space, and because Marge has never made her labor visible in a way that demands recognition. She comes home from prison to a house that has collapsed without her, and she sets about restoring order, and the restoration happens so smoothly and so quickly that within a single scene it is as though she was never gone, which is its own kind of dark commentary on what invisible labor looks like when it is suddenly made available again. Marge versus singles, seniors, childless couples, teens, and gays. Season 15, Episode 8. This episode is a broad satire of political factionalism and is not primarily a Marge episode in the serious sense. But it contains a thread that is worth following, which is Marge's frustration at being lumped into a demographic that dismisses everything she values. The episode's most honest moment is when Marge articulates, briefly and clearly, that the work of raising children is not valued by the culture at large in the way that she believes it should be. This is not a complex or surprising observation, but it is one that Marge rarely makes directly in the show's run, and when she does make it, the directness of it stands out against the usual background of her quiet endurance. Marge is not a martyr figure in the show. She is not presented as suffering in the operatic way that martyred women in television often suffer. Her suffering is quieter, more distributed, more embedded in the daily texture of her life. But it is there. It has always been there. And the episodes that surface it briefly, that let Marge say or feel directly what she usually processes internally and silently, are the ones that reveal how much the show has been holding beneath its cheerful surface all along. The picture that emerges from all of these episodes together is of a woman who has been present, capable, perceptive, and undervalued in every room she has occupied for 36 years. Who loves her husband despite his many consistent failures? Who loves her children with a completeness that occasionally costs her the self she had before they arrived? Who is the structural reason that the family has not completely fallen apart? And who rarely receives acknowledgement for this function? And who has decided, on some level, that the acknowledgement is less important than the function? There is a kind of heroism in that decision, but there is also a kind of loss in it, and the show knows this, and it surfaces the knowledge in the episodes we've been discussing before, covering it over again with the next week's comedy. Marge Simpson is the show's most honest character. She is the one who sees clearly, who responds rationally, who holds her ground in the face of chaos, who maintains the structure that everything else depends on. She is also the one whose story gets told least fully, whose inner life is least examined, whose complexity is most consistently reduced to the role she plays for others. That gap between who Marge is and how fully the show allows itself to explore who Marge is itself a dark thing. The show built a character of extraordinary depth and then mostly used her as furniture. The episodes that treated her as something more than furniture are the ones that stay with you, because they reveal how much was there the whole time. Number Section 5. Burns, Smithers, and the Architecture of Cruelty. Mr. Burns is the show's villain. This is straightforward, and the show does not attempt to complicate it. He is the billionaire who owns the power plant that poisons Springfield, who controls the town's economy, who uses his vast resources to punish anyone who challenges him, and to purchase immunity from any consequences for anything he has ever done. He is, within the logic of the show's universe, the source of most of what is wrong with Springfield. But the show has been doing something more interesting with Burns than simple villainy since very early in its run. It has been showing you a man who is also, in his own way, trapped. A man who has spent over a century building and maintaining a system designed specifically to protect him, and who cannot see, from inside the system, that the protection has come at the cost of everything that makes protection worth having. Burns does not have friends. He has Smithers, and the relationship between Burns and Smithers is one of the show's most quietly devastating pieces of sustained characterization. Smithers' devotion, a dark constant. Smithers has loved Burns for the entirety of the show's run. His devotion is total, unconditional, and almost entirely unrequited in the specific way that Smithers needs it to be reciprocated. Burns values Smithers. Burns depends on Smithers. Burns would be, in the most literal sense, dead without Smithers' management of his medical treatments and his schedule and his general logistical existence. But Burns does not love Smithers. This is made explicit in multiple episodes and implied in hundreds of others. Burns's relationship with Smithers is the relationship of a man with a useful and reliable tool. A tool he would miss if it were gone. A tool he would be genuinely distressed to lose. But a tool nonetheless. Smithers has organized his entire existence around a man who will never give him what he needs. This is not a situation the show plays entirely for comedy. In the episodes that center on Smithers, there is a particular quality of sadness to his circumstances that the comedy sits on top of rather than replacing. Homer the Smithers, Season 7, Episode 17. Burns sends Smithers on vacation, against his will, and Homer is assigned to be Burns's assistant in his absence. The comedy is generated by Homer's spectacular incompetence at the role, but the episode's emotional undercurrent is about Smithers' absence and what that absence means. Smithers, on his mandated vacation, cannot stop thinking about Burns. He calls, he checks in. He is unable to be present in any other place because his entire self has been organized around the function of serving Burns. When he is removed from that function, he does not know who he is. He has no self that exists independent of his role as Burns's assistant. This is presented with enough lightness that it registers as characterization rather than tragedy, but the underlying truth is devastating. Smithers has given decades of his life to a man who treats him as a function, and in the absence of that function, Smithers discovers that the man he has given those decades to has not left him with anything that belongs to him. He has only the role, and without the role he is genuinely at a loss. Burns's various cruelties, the texture of his villainy. The show's catalog of Burns's cruelties is vast and varied, but the ones that qualify as genuinely dark, rather than comically dark, tend to be the ones that are small. Burns cannot remember Homer's name. After more than a decade of Homer working in his plant, after all the times their paths have crossed, after all the episodes in which Homer has been pivotal to some crisis or resolution at the plant, Burns cannot retain the name of the man. This is played as a running gag, and it is, from one angle, very funny. But from another angle, it is the depiction of a man so completely indifferent to the inner life of another person that he cannot extend the most basic courtesy of remembering their name. Burns does not see Homer as a person. He sees him as an element in a system. Homer's personhood is literally not interesting enough to Burns to register. The episode Who Shot Mr. Burns Part 1 catalogs Burns's specific cruelties in a way that makes the eventual shooting feel not just justified but inevitable. He destroys the elementary school's arts program. He financially ruins Moe's Tavern. He collapses the retirement home. He injures a dog. And for his finale, he blocks out the sun so that every resident of Springfield is dependent on his power plant for artificial light. This is not simple corporate greed. This is the behavior of a man who understands exactly what he is doing to people and finds the understanding pleasurable. Burns, Baby Burns Season 8, Episode 4. Burns discovers he has a son, Larry, played as a warm and ordinary schlub who is the complete opposite of his father in every possible way. The episode's comedy comes from the contrast between Burns's imperious manner and Larry's cheerful mediocrity. Burns is appalled by his son. Larry's ordinariness is an offense to Burns's image of himself. The dark heart of this episode is the reunion that isn't. Burns has a child he never knew existed, and when given the opportunity to know him, he rejects that child because the child is not what Burns would have wanted him to be. The rejection is not cruel in the way Burns's cruelties usually are. It is simply honest. Burns cannot pretend to feel a connection he doesn't feel. He cannot manufacture warmth for a child who represents everything Burns considers beneath him. And Larry, rather than being devastated, takes this in stride with the same cheerful resilience he brings to everything else. Larry is fine. Larry will be fine. He has a life that suits him, and a father who rejected him, and neither of these facts appears to particularly alter his basic contentment. But the episode stays with you because of what it reveals about Burns. He has lived more than a century, and he has built an empire, and he has ensured his own survival through extraordinary means, and at the end of all of it he encounters his own son, a person who is quite literally part of him, and he feels nothing that the encounter can sustain. Burns is the end product of a life spent prioritizing power over connection, and when connection is offered to him, he has lost whatever capacity he once had to receive it. Monty Can't Buy Me Love Season 10, Episode 21. Burns, after discovering that he is regarded as universally despised, attempts to become likable. He goes through various strategies with Smithers' assistance. He gives away money, he makes public appearances, he attempts warmth. Nothing works. Springfield despises Burns in a bone-deep way that transcends anything he does on the surface. The episode is a comedy, and a fairly light one, but it contains a genuine tragedy that the lightness doesn't quite cover. Burns wants to be liked. This seems startling given everything we know about him, but the show treats it as real rather than ironic. He genuinely does not want to be universally hated. He wants something that functions like public affection. And the episode suggests, quietly, that the thing preventing him from having it is not any specific action, but the entire structure of who he is, which has been built over more than a century in direct opposition to the values that make a person likable. Burns cannot become likable because becoming likable would require dismantling the system that has kept him alive and powerful and protected. The likability and the power are mutually exclusive, and Burns made his choice between them so long ago that the choice has become invisible to him. He chose power. And the cost of that choice is this episode, this lonely attempt at connection that fails before it begins because the connection would require something Burns gave up too long ago to recover. The retirement of Burns, a missing episode. The show has never done a Burns retirement episode. Burns does not retire. He cannot retire because, as we've established, the Empire exists specifically to sustain him, and he exists specifically to sustain the Empire. They feed each other in an endless loop that cannot be interrupted. But consider what a Burns retirement episode might look like if the show ever committed to imagining it honestly. Burns at the end of a working day, the plant shut down, Smithers gone home, the Empire handed off. Burns sitting alone in his enormous house, surrounded by the artifacts of his century-plus of accumulation, with no schedule to keep and no one to dominate and no system to manage. What is Burns without Burns Enterprises? What is he without Smithers' logistical devotion and the plant's daily crises and the ongoing project of ensuring that Springfield remains dependent on his infrastructure? The show has never answered this question because it has never asked it, but it has given us enough information to guess at the answer, and the answer is not comfortable. Burns without his function is the same void that Smithers without his function is. The architecture of cruelty that Burns has built over a century is not just a system of exploitation, it is also a system of meaning. It is the thing that gives his days structure and purpose, and the specific satisfaction that comes from exercising power. Without it, he is a very old man alone in a very large house, kept alive by weekly radiation treatments that exist to serve a life that has ceased to contain anything worth the trouble of sustaining. This is the darkness at the center of the Burns character that the show circles without quite landing on. Not that Burns is cruel, but that the cruelty is the only thing Burns has left, and that this is a portrait of what happens to a person who chooses accumulation over connection across the span of an entire human life, which, in Burns's case, is considerably longer than most. The institutional cruelty of Springfield? Burns is the most visible symbol of Springfield's institutional cruelty, but he is not the only instance of it. The cruelty is systemic. It exists in the school system, in the police force, in the medical establishment, in the political structure of the town. Chief Wiggum is an incompetent and corrupt law enforcement officer. This is played for comedy across the entire run of the show. But the accumulation of Wiggum's failures, his inability or unwillingness to actually protect the people he is supposed to protect, his susceptibility to bribery, his procedural laziness, constitutes a portrait of a community that has no reliable institutional protection. Springfield's residents cannot depend on the law to operate fairly. They cannot depend on the school to educate their children effectively. They cannot depend on the medical establishment to treat them without Burns's influence shaping the care they receive. The institutions that should protect and serve a community have been captured by the same forces that are harming that community, and the people living inside this system are largely unaware of how completely they have been abandoned. This is the dark institutional background against which all of the personal stories we've been discussing take place. Homer's suffering is not just Homer's personal misfortune. It is the predictable outcome of a system designed to produce people like Homer, damaged and compliant and too limited to challenge the architecture of their own oppression. The individual darkness of the characters is inseparable from the institutional darkness of the community. Springfield is not a town that failed its residents by accident. It is a town that has been systematically arranged so that the residents cannot recognize the mechanisms of their own failure. Burns built this. Burns benefits from it. and the show has been quietly describing it in the language of comedy for 36 years. Number. Section 6. Springfield's Forgotten Side Characters and Their Buried Tragedies. The Simpsons has one of the deepest benches of recurring characters in the history of American animation. The writers built Springfield into a full community over the first several seasons, populating it with dozens of characters who exist at the edges of the frame and occasionally step forward long enough to reveal something unexpected. Some of those revelations are comedic. Some of them are considerably darker than the show's reputation for comedy might suggest. Sideshow Bob the Man Who Keeps Coming Back? Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr., known as Sideshow Bob, is the show's most recurring antagonist after Burns. He is also, by a significant margin, the most psychologically complex villain in the show's history, and some of his episodes qualify as among the darkest material in the entire run. Bob's essential story is a tragedy in the classical sense. He is a man of extraordinary intelligence and capability, a graduate of Oxford, a gifted performer, a person who could have excelled at virtually anything he chose to pursue. He chose instead to make the systematic destruction of a 10-year-old child the organizing purpose of his existence. And the show has never quite explained how a person arrives at that choice, which is part of what makes Bob so unsettling. The episode Sideshow Bob Roberts, in which Bob runs for mayor of Springfield on a conservative political platform and wins through voter fraud, demonstrates what Bob could do if he applied his considerable intelligence to legitimate ends. He is an effective political operative. He understands rhetoric and persuasion, he can move people, and he uses all of this in service of an agenda that is, at its core, about destroying Bart Simpson. The Cape Fear episode in Season 5 is the show's most sustained exercise in the Bob mythology, and it is one of the finest things the show ever produced. Bob is released from prison and immediately begins stalking the Simpson family with the clear intention of killing Bart. The episode is a thriller parody and a very good one, but it is also, in its quieter moments, the portrait of a man whose entire inner life has been colonized by a fixation that he cannot explain and cannot escape. Bob has had opportunities to leave Bart behind. He has, in various episodes, achieved things that should have satisfied him or at least redirected him. He has loved and been loved. He has had relationships that offered him alternatives to the loop he cannot break free of. And he always comes back to Bart. Always. The loop is stronger than the alternatives. The dark reading of Bob is that he represents the specific tragedy of intelligence in service of self-destruction. He is the smartest person in most rooms he occupies. And he has spent decades applying that intelligence to something that has cost him everything. His career, his freedom, his relationships, his potential, and any version of a life that might have been worth living. Bart is not the tragedy of Sideshow Bob's story. Bob's inability to stop making Bart the center of his story is the tragedy. Barney Gumble, The Wasted Life. Barney Gumble is Homer's oldest friend. He is also the show's most sustained portrait of alcoholism, rendered with a consistent specificity that goes far beyond the comedy of a man who is perpetually drunk. Barney and Homer went to high school together. In flashback episodes, the young Barney is shown as a person of genuine capability and possibility. He had ambitions. He had talent. He had, before Homer's influence introduced him to his first beer, a trajectory that led somewhere other than Moe's Tavern. The flashback to their high school years, in which Homer hands Barney his first drink and Barney's face changes in a way that signals the beginning of the end, is played for comedy but understood as something considerably darker. Homer, without intending to, changed the direction of his friend's life with a single, casual gesture. Barney's subsequent 3 decades in a bar stool are the consequence of that gesture, and the show never allows the consequence to go unacknowledged, even as it deploys Barney as comic relief. The episode, A Star is Burns, in which Barney submits a short film to a film festival and the film is a devastating and precise portrait of his own alcoholism, is one of the show's most unexpectedly affecting pieces of work. The film is played within the episode as a joke about contrast. It is infinitely more sophisticated than the other entries in the festival, but submitted by the least sophisticated person in Springfield. But the content of the film, a black and white depiction of the specific desolation of a wasted life, is real. Barney made something honest about himself, something that required him to see himself clearly and render that vision in a form that could be shared. And the town receives it as comedy because they receive everything about Barney as comedy. The episode A Beer with Homer, in later seasons, shows Barney at a point of sobriety, and the portrait of sober Barney is both hopeful and heartbreaking, because we know, by the time this episode airs, what the end of the story looks like. Barney will drink again. The show will return him to the bar stool. The sobriety will not stick, not because Barney lacks the desire for something better, but because the show cannot accommodate a Barney who is different, a Barney who has genuinely changed. Barney is trapped in his character the way the other characters are trapped in theirs. The loop will not break. Springfield will not accommodate growth. And Barney Gumble will continue to exist in whatever version of a life fits between one drink and the next, visible enough to be used for comedy and examined occasionally for something darker, but ultimately unable to change because change is not something Springfield allows. Nelson Muntz, the boy without a home. Nelson is introduced as Bart's bully, and gradually revealed to be one of the most genuinely pitiable characters in the show's universe. His mother is absent or neglectful. His father is absent and, when he occasionally appears, useless in ways that make his absence seem preferable. Nelson lives in conditions that the show occasionally depicts and then moves past quickly, because dwelling on them would undermine the comedy that Nelson's bullying is supposed to generate. Nelson's cruelty toward Bart and others is not random. It is the behavior of a child who has never had anyone model anything different, who has had to develop a defensive toughness because the alternative was complete vulnerability in a situation that offered no protection. The bully is a product of conditions the show alludes to but never fully depicts, because fully depicting them would make Nelson's role in the show impossible to sustain. The episodes that center on Nelson's home life are among the show's most quietly devastating. The bare kitchen, the mother who disappears without explanation and returns with equally little context, the father whose appearances are defined by inadequacy, Nelson navigating these conditions with a pragmatism that looks, from outside, like resilience, but is actually the specific adaptation of a child who learned very early that no one was coming to rescue him. Nelson's laugh, his signature contribution to Springfield's soundscape, is funny in isolation. In the context of everything the show gradually reveals about where Nelson lives and how he lives, and who is not there to take care of him, it starts to sound different, like the specific deflection of a kid who turns pain into performance, because performance is safer than the alternative. Chief Wiggum, the failure of protection? We have discussed Wiggum already in the context of institutional cruelty, but he deserves individual attention because his failures are specific and consistent, and the consequences of those failures fall on real people within the show's universe. Wiggum is not malicious. He is lazy and self-interested and fundamentally unsuited to the role he occupies, but he does not intend harm in the active sense. His harm is the harm of non-action, of the person who is supposed to show up and doesn't, of the protective function that fails because the person occupying it has never taken the function seriously. The episode Homer versus the 18th Amendment, in which prohibition is briefly enacted in Springfield and Wiggum is supposed to enforce it, reveals Wiggum's character with unusual clarity. He is easily corrupted. He is more interested in the personal benefits of his position than in the responsibilities that come with it. He is the specific kind of authority figure who has never understood that authority is a social contract rather than a personal privilege. This would be fine as simple comedy if Wiggum's failures were confined to broad situations, but the show has also shown Wiggum failing in small, personal ways, failing specific individuals who needed protection and didn't receive it because Wiggum was somewhere else, or wasn't paying attention, or found the situation inconvenient. These failures have consequences within the show's universe that the comedy skips past, but that accumulate into a portrait of a community that is genuinely unsafe, in ways that nobody in it fully acknowledges. Groundskeeper Willie the man outside? Willie is Scottish, angry, and physically enormous, and the show deploys him primarily as a comedic figure, a man whose extravagant machismo is a reliable source of laughs. But the show has also given Willie a backstory that, when it surfaces, reveals him as one of Springfield's most thoroughly displaced characters. Willie has been in Springfield for decades. He maintains the school grounds. He lives in several episodes in a shack on school property that can only generously be described as shelter. He has no visible social connections outside his work. He has no family he ever mentions with warmth. He exists in Springfield the way a piece of infrastructure exists, functional and permanent, and never quite inside the community it serves. The episodes that give Willie full emotional sequences, his response to the loss of a love interest, his occasional vulnerability beneath the aggressive exterior, reveal a man who is profoundly lonely in a place he has never quite joined. He works in a community that tolerates him without accepting him, and he has been doing this work for long enough that he seems to have stopped expecting anything different. There is a specific sadness to Willie's situation that the comedy of his character has always sat on top of but never quite covered. He is the outsider who stayed. The man who came to Springfield for reasons the show has never fully explained and found that leaving was harder than arriving and that belonging was harder still. He is there. He is useful. He is not quite part of it. And the show, in its rare moments of honesty about Willie, acknowledges that this is not a comfortable way to spend a life. The Forgotten Springfield Residents. A pattern. Across the show's 36 years, certain patterns emerge in how the side characters are deployed. The comedy requires them to be available for use when the plot needs them and unremarkable when it doesn't. But the show, in building a complete community, also built in the implications of what it means to be all these specific people, living all these specific lives in this specific town. Hans Moleman, who has been killed and returned to life dozens of times, is simultaneously the show's most extreme joke about death's reversibility in Springfield, and its most extreme example of a character who exists purely to suffer. The show has told us he is 31 years old. He appears to be in his late 80s. Something accelerated his aging catastrophically, and the show has never explained what. And in the meantime, he keeps appearing in new episodes to be harmed again in new ways that the comedy treats as inconsequential. The recurring Springfield residents who exist in the background of large crowd scenes, the faces the animators built to populate the town, each of them represents a life that the show chose not to tell, and the untold lives accumulate into a sense of Springfield as a place where suffering is not exceptional but ambient, where the background noise of everyday existence contains more difficulty than the foreground comedy ever quite acknowledges. These are Springfield's forgotten characters, and their specific darkness is the darkness of context, of the world that exists around the primary story, of the lives that are happening in every frame, whether the camera is focused on them or not. Number Section 7. The Treehouse of Horror episodes that crossed a line. Every October since the show's second season, The Simpsons has produced a special anthology episode called Treehouse of Horror. These episodes operate outside the show's normal continuity, which has historically given the writers license to do things that the regular episodes could not accommodate. Characters die, reality breaks. The show's familiar faces are placed in genuinely horrifying situations, and the comedy of the anthology format is the permission to take those situations further than the main series would allow. Most Treehouse of Horror segments are horror comedies in the truest sense, using genre conventions to generate laughs rather than fear. But across 36 years of these specials, certain segments have crossed from horror comedy into something that functions less as comedy and more as something the viewer needs to sit with afterward. Treehouse of Horror v. The Shining. This segment, a parody of Stanley Kubrick's adaptation of the Stephen King novel, follows Homer as he descends into violent madness, while caretaking a resort cut off from television and beer. The parody is affectionate and frequently very funny, with some of the show's sharpest writing compressed into a short format. But the segment is also a sustained depiction of domestic violence, played for laughs but functionally about a father with an axe pursuing his family through a resort while his wife and children try to escape him. The comedy of the parody framing keeps the horror at a distance during viewing, but in the quiet afterward, what you've watched is a man trying to kill his family, rendered in loving comedic detail. The Bart character's psychic abilities, borrowed from the novel's Danny, are used here to summon help, and the segment resolves happily and absurdly. But the central image, Homer's face at the door, his voice cycling through variations on "no television and no beer make Homer something something," is more genuinely unsettling than the show usually allows itself to be, because it is simultaneously funny and the face of a person who has gone somewhere his family cannot reach him. Treehouse of Horror. 4. Bart's Dog Gets an F. Devil and Homer Simpson. The Devil and Homer Simpson segment is one of the all-time Treehouse classics. Homer sells his soul for a donut. The devil claims it must be consumed. Homer eats all but the last bite and then puts it in the refrigerator, and a trial in hell determines that Homer's soul belongs to Marge because she wrote Homer's name on her wedding cake. This is wonderful and funny, and the episode is rightly celebrated. But the segment also depicts hell in some detail. And the hell it depicts is not abstract. It is specific. It is Homer being force-fed donuts for eternity in a room designed specifically for his particular weaknesses. The punishment is custom-built. Someone designed it for him personally, engineered to use his specific appetites against him in a way that converts pleasure into unending suffering. The joke is that Homer enjoys it, which is very funny. But underneath the joke is a depiction of a man whose pleasures are so thoroughly his vulnerabilities that the distinction between heaven and hell is simply the same thing without the ability to stop. Treehouse of Horror 7. The Thing and I? Bart discovers that he has a twin, Hugo, who was separated from him at birth because he was the evil twin and has since been living in the attic, kept alive by fish heads. The revelation is played for horror comedy, and the segment moves quickly enough that the comedy mostly holds. But take the segment seriously for a moment, and what you have is a child who has been imprisoned in his own home's attic for his entire life on the basis of a presumption of his nature. Hugo did nothing that warranted his imprisonment. He was locked away because someone decided, at the moment of his birth, that he was evil and that this evil made him unfit for the family. He was wrong in a particular, specific, unchosen way and was separated from everyone who might have loved him on the basis of that wrongness. The twist ending, in which it is revealed that Bart was actually the evil twin all along and that Hugo was the one who should have been kept in the attic, is designed as a comedic subversion. But it also suggests that the original classification was arbitrary, that the determination of which child was worth keeping and which was worth discarding was made on shaky grounds, which retroactively makes Hugo's imprisonment even more uncomfortable. Treehouse of Horror 6 Homer 3. Homer discovers a three-dimensional space behind the living room bookcase and retreats into it, only to find that the two-dimensional rules of his existence do not apply there. The segment is a remarkable piece of animation for its time, and it is mostly played for the wonder of its visual inventiveness. But the segment's ending is strange in a way that doesn't quite belong to comedy. Homer escapes from the three-dimensional world back into what he believes is his familiar reality, only to discover that he has emerged into a real-world Los Angeles that operates on rules entirely different from Springfield's. He is there, in the world, and he is completely unprepared for it. And the segment ends on this image: Homer on a real city street, confused and alone, with none of the structures that have always surrounded him to orient or protect him. The comedy of the ending is the absurdity of the juxtaposition, but there is something in that final image, the familiar figure displaced into an unfamiliar world that will not accommodate him, that resonates with something real. Homer outside the structures of Springfield is Homer without the specific support system that his limitations require. He is not equipped for a world that doesn't already know him. And the treehouse format ends there, before he can find his way back or forward, leaving him permanently displaced in that final frame. Treehouse of Horror 8. The H-Omega Mega Man. A neutron bomb destroys Springfield, leaving Homer as one of the only surviving humans in a world of mutant Springfieldians who intend to eat him. The segment is a post-apocalyptic parody and largely plays as such. But the early section of the segment, before the bomb falls, includes a moment where Homer briefly celebrates Springfield's destruction from a bunker, relieved to be free of the town and its demands. He walks through the ruins of his community, the dead homes of his neighbors, and experiences something that the segment allows to function as liberation. For a brief moment, Homer is free. Everything that defined his life and required things of him is gone. And he is happy. The segment then walks this back by introducing the mutant threat, which requires Homer to fight for survival and eventually to reconnect with his family. But that brief moment of Homer's relief at Springfield's destruction is darker than most of the Treehouse content, because it reveals a resentment that the regular episodes keep carefully submerged. The town that has contained Homer for 36 years is also, in some register that the comedy usually prevents from surfacing, a prison. And Homer's brief, guilty, quickly suppressed happiness at its destruction is the show's most honest acknowledgement of that. The overall pattern of Treehouse darkness. The Treehouse of Horror episodes function as a release valve for the show's suppressed darkness. Because the episodes operate outside continuity, because characters can die and worlds can end, and nothing that happens here will carry into next week's episode, the writers can take the show's themes to their logical extremes without consequence. And what those extremes tend to reveal, across 36 years of Treehouse content, is a set of anxieties that the regular episodes are always circling. The fear of losing your family, the fear of losing yourself, The fear of being trapped in a situation that cannot change. The fear that the comfortable structures of your life are more fragile than you've allowed yourself to believe. The fear that the people you love are somehow not who you thought they were. These are Homer's fears. They are also Marge's fears and Bart's fears and Lisa's fears. And the treehouse format gives them permission to be fears rather than jokes, briefly and safely, before the reset button is pressed and everything goes back to normal for another week. The segments that cross from horror comedy into something more uncomfortable are the ones where the fears are most specifically rendered, where the horror stops being abstract and starts looking like something that could, under the right circumstances, be real. Those segments don't haunt you because they're scary. They haunt you because they're honest. The late Treehouse segments, when the format got stranger. In later seasons, as the show aged and the world it was commenting on changed, the Treehouse episodes began to incorporate a different quality of darkness. Not the horror comedy darkness of the early specials, but something more diffuse and harder to categorize. Segments about technology, about surveillance, about the specific anxieties of contemporary life appeared alongside the traditional horror parodies. And these segments sometimes operated less as comedy than as something closer to commentary, observations about the world rendered in the Treehouse format's permission to be extreme. These later Treehouse segments are not uniformly successful. Some of them feel like the show trying to engage with a contemporary darkness it doesn't quite have the language for. But in their failures, they reveal something. The show's awareness that the world has produced new forms of horror that the original Treehouse format wasn't designed to address. The anxiety is there. The show knows something is wrong. It doesn't always know how to say it. Number. Section 8. Death, Grief, and the Episodes That Forgot to Be Funny. The Simpsons has handled death more times and more variously than almost any other comedy on television. Some of those deaths are played for comedy, some of them are played for sentiment, and some of them are handled with a raw and direct honesty that is completely at odds with the show's reputation as an entertainment. The episodes in this category are the ones that stopped performing their genre and simply told the truth about what loss feels like. Round Springfield Season 6, Episode 22. This is the episode where Bleeding Gums Murphy dies. Murphy is Lisa's mentor, a jazz musician who appeared in an early episode and was established as the person who understood Lisa's musical soul and validated it in a way that most of Springfield could not. Murphy dies in a hospital while Lisa is visiting him. The death is handled quietly, without drama, in the way that deaths in hospitals often actually occur. He is there and then he is not there, and Lisa is left standing in a corridor with the specific weight of a loss that she didn't have time to prepare for. What the episode does with Lisa's grief is more interesting than most television grief. She is not merely sad, she is angry. She is angry at the unfairness of it, at the way someone who gave joy to the world could be removed from it with so little ceremony and so little acknowledgement. And she uses the anger to make something, to honor Murphy in a way that costs her something, which is the most honest thing the show ever said about how grief functions in a person who doesn't have anywhere to put it. The scene where Murphy's image appears on a cloud and plays a saxophone while Lisa plays along from the ground below is the episode's most famous image, and it is genuinely moving, but it is also the show finding a way to soften the loss with fantasy, to give Lisa a moment of connection that the reality of death denied her. The fantasy is kind. It is also a recognition that the reality without it was not something the show was willing to leave Lisa with alone. Old Money Season 2, Episode 17. This is a Grandpa Simpson episode, and it is one of the show's earliest and most sustained engagements with mortality. Grandpa falls in love with a fellow resident of the Springfield retirement castle. She dies, and Grandpa, inheriting money from her, must decide what to do with it. The comedy of the episode is in the various people who come to him asking for the money and the situations their requests generate. But the emotional core is in the grief. Grandpa loved this woman. He had arrived at an age where he had reason to expect that the opportunities for genuine connection were narrowing, and she appeared as an exception, a late grace, a reason to look forward to the next week. And then she died. The episode does not minimize this. It allows Grandpa's grief to be real, to take up space in the narrative, to be treated as the serious and significant thing it is rather than as a comedic beat or a setup for the episode's plot. Grandpa's loss is acknowledged and respected, and the episode's resolution, in which he uses the money to improve the retirement castle's facilities in her memory, is handled with a warmth that is entirely free of irony. This is an unusual thing for The Simpsons to do. The show's treatment of the elderly is often satirical, using Grandpa as a figure of comedic irrelevance, a man whose stories end before their points, and whose relationship to contemporary reality is one of cheerful disconnection. This episode sets that aside entirely and treats him as a full person, capable of love and loss and meaningful action in response to both. Lisa the Vegetarian Season 7, Episode 5. This is not primarily a death episode, but it is an episode about the specific confrontation with mortality that comes when a child fully understands for the first time where meat comes from and what that understanding means for the choices she makes. Lisa befriends a lamb at a petting zoo and immediately, upon returning home, cannot bring herself to eat lamb chops for dinner. The episode follows her through the development of her vegetarianism and the various conflicts that this creates with her family and community, and it is largely played as a comedy about conviction and stubbornness and the social difficulty of making choices that differ from those around you. But the emotional origin of Lisa's vegetarianism is a child confronting the fact that animals die for our food. This is not abstract. Lisa looked at a specific animal, felt a specific connection, and understood in a direct and immediate way that this connection was the same one that existed between her and every piece of meat she had ever eaten. The recognition is genuinely disturbing when you take it seriously, which the episode partially invites you to do before moving on to the comedy. The episode resolves with Lisa keeping her convictions and the family accepting this, which is a warm and appropriate ending. But the moment of recognition that started everything, the specific moral weight that settled on an 8-year-old at a petting zoo and refused to lift, is the episode's dark seed, and the warmth of the ending grows from that dark seed rather than replacing it. Alone Again? Natura Diddley Season 11, Episode 14. This is the episode where Maud Flanders dies. The show kills Maud Flanders at a NASCAR race, in a freak accident involving a t-shirt cannon. Homer is in the path of the fired t-shirts and ducks out of the way, and the shirts strike Maud instead, knocking her from the bleachers to her death. Homer's act of self-preservation, his perfectly ordinary and completely instinctive ducking out of the way, is the direct cause of Ned Flanders losing his wife. The comedy of the episode's opening section is about the absurdity of the accident's circumstances. The dark truth of those same circumstances is that Homer killed Ned's wife by trying to protect himself. What the episode does with this is unexpected. It doesn't wallow in Homer's guilt, which would have been the easier emotional path. It focuses on Ned, on how Ned manages his grief, on Ned's faith being tested in the specific, grinding way that faith is tested not by sudden crisis but by the ongoing requirement to maintain hope in the face of loss. Ned misses Maud. The show allows him to miss her in a way that is not performed or resolved quickly. The emptiness of the house without her, the specific presence of her absence in every room, Ned trying to re-engage with life while carrying the weight of a loss that is too large to be carried quietly but too private to be shared with a community that doesn't quite know how to help him. The episode eventually moves toward comedy again, as Simpsons episodes do. But before it does, it gives Ned's grief the space it deserves. And in that space, something true is said about what loss looks like from inside, about the texture of daily existence after the person who defined your daily existence is suddenly gone. Mother Simpsons Season 7, Episode 8. We have discussed this episode in the context of Mona's story, but it deserves separate consideration here for how it handles Homer's grief and joy simultaneously. Homer discovers that his mother is alive and spends the episode in a state of uncomplicated happiness that the show grants him generously and without irony. He has his mother back. After a lifetime of believing she chose death over staying with him, he has proof that she was taken from him rather than leaving of her own will. The grief of his childhood is retroactively given a different shape, and the shape is more bearable. But then she has to go again. Burns identifies her and reports her. The FBI comes. Mona must flee once more, and Homer, who has had one day with his mother after a lifetime without her, must say goodbye again, this time knowing why, this time knowing it is not because she doesn't love him. The final scene is Homer sitting on the hood of his car, alone, watching the night sky. No music, no dialogue. Just Homer, alone, looking up, while the camera holds on him for a long moment before the credits roll. The show earned that silence. Every second of the final scene works because everything before it worked, because the episode built Homer's joy carefully enough that its interruption has real weight, because the goodbye is rendered with enough restraint to feel true. Homer doesn't cry. He sits. He looks up. He is holding something he cannot put down, something the show does not name for him, or resolve for him, or turn into a lesson. He just sits, and the episode ends. This is The Simpsons at its most honest, which is also The Simpsons at its most quietly devastating. And Maggie Makes 3 revisited in the context of loss? We discussed this episode earlier in the Homer section, but it belongs here too, because the episode's emotional logic is the logic of grief. Homer mourns the career he wanted and cannot have. He grieves the bowling alley in the same way a person grieves any version of themselves they can clearly see but cannot reach. The loss is real even if it's not death. Even if what was lost was only a possibility, a direction the life could have taken and didn't. The show's most honest episodes about loss are not always the ones about death. Sometimes they are about the smaller, quieter losses that don't get acknowledged as losses because there is no funeral for a path not taken, no ceremony to mark the moment when a life becomes something other than what it might have been. These are the losses that accumulate silently, that are carried without being put down, that define a person's relationship to their own life in ways that are difficult to articulate and harder to resolve. Homer carries these losses. Marge carries them. The children carry anticipatory versions of them, the sense of future loss that comes from being young in a world that has already shaped itself in ways that will limit them. Springfield is full of people carrying losses they have never named, and the episodes that see those losses clearly are the show's most essential work. The death of a dream, the long grief of not becoming. There is a category of loss in The Simpsons that has no specific episode because it is the background condition of many episodes. It is the loss of becoming. The loss that occurs when a person's life settles, finally and irrevocably, into a shape that is not the shape they imagined, and they must learn to inhabit the shape they have rather than the one they expected. Homer experienced this loss when he took Bart to the bowling alley in the episode we discussed and felt for a moment what his life might have been. Lisa experiences it regularly. The gap between her capabilities and her circumstances, a constant low-level grief that the show has never resolved because it cannot be resolved, only endured. Even Burns experiences it, though his version is inverted. Burns never wanted anything different from what he has. But what Burns has, at the end of more than a century of accumulation, is not the same as what he wanted when he began. The empire grew, the power grew, and whatever Burns was before the empire began, whatever he might have been in the absence of the choices that made him who he is, that person is gone. Not grieved, probably, but gone. The Simpsons is, at its deepest level, a show about loss. About the loss that comes with staying, and the loss that comes with leaving, and the loss that accumulates between decisions in the ordinary passage of time that no one is paying adequate attention to. The comedy is the show's way of making that loss bearable to look at. And the episodes that step past the comedy, that look at the loss directly, are the ones that reveal what the comedy was always keeping company with. Section 9. The episodes that predicted real darkness. The Simpsons has been credited with predicting dozens of future events across its 36-year run. We have discussed the mechanics of this phenomenon in the context of the transcript, the combination of prolific output and confirmation bias, and the natural tendency of smart people observing trends to extrapolate toward eventual realities. But the predictions that concern this section are not the cheerful ones. Not the smartwatch or the commercial space travel or the gentle comedy of a Trump presidency. The predictions that concern this section are the dark ones. The episodes that seem to anticipate not just events but the specific quality of pain that surrounded those events. Marge in Chains and the Pandemic. In the 1993 episode Marge in Chains, a flu virus called the Osaka flu spreads from Japan to Springfield, causing mass panic, overwhelming the healthcare system, and producing exactly the kind of hoarding and supply chain collapse that characterized the early months of the COVID-19 pandemic nearly 3 decades later. The episode's comedic treatment of the outbreak does not prevent it from being an accurate portrait of how communities respond to infectious disease emergencies. The panic buying, the rumor and misinformation, the overwhelmed medical infrastructure, the community's desperate search for someone or something to blame. These details are not specific to any one outbreak. They are the reliable features of how human communities respond to invisible biological threats, and the episode captured them with enough precision that, watching it after March of 2020, produces an unambiguous and uncomfortable sensation. The additional detail of the killer bees, introduced into Springfield during the fake flu outbreak, mirrors the murder hornet panic that ran alongside the actual pandemic in 2020, a secondary anxiety emerging from the chaos of a primary crisis, which is also a reliable feature of how communities manage collective fear. The episode was not prophecy, it was observation, as the show's producers have consistently maintained, but observation made with enough precision and specificity to locate truths about human behavior that proved durable across decades. The dark implication is that what the show observed in 1993 about how communities respond to health crises was accurate enough in 2020 that watching the episode felt like watching documentation rather than satire. The human patterns hadn't changed. The vulnerabilities hadn't been addressed. The systems that failed in the Springfield of the episode's fiction failed in much the same way in the actual world, and the show knew this would happen the way you know a storm is coming, not through prophecy, but through the ability to read weather. Bart to the Future and the Trump Presidency, the episode that placed Donald Trump in the presidency of the United States in the year 2000 as a joke about celebrity and political decay became, 16 years later, not a joke, but a fact. We have discussed the mechanics of this prediction in terms of trend extrapolation, but what deserves attention here, in this section, is the quality of the prediction. The episode didn't merely predict that a celebrity might become president. It predicted the specific quality of the aftermath, the financial disorder, the sense of inherited problems, the specific cultural register of what follows a presidency defined by spectacle and ego. Lisa inherits the mess. This detail proved accurate, not as a specific presidential succession, but as a description of what the presidency meant and what it left behind. The dark version of this prediction is not the prediction itself, which is funny in retrospect in the way that very accurate satire tends to be. The dark version is what it says about the legibility of American politics, that a cartoon made for laughs in the year 2000 was a more accurate portrait of where things were headed than most of the political commentary that surrounded the actual election in 2016. The show read something that the more serious observers missed, or perhaps they all read it and chose not to say so in the same register. The corruption of small-town authority. Across dozens of episodes, The Simpsons depicted the specific way in which small-town institutional authority can be captured by concentrated wealth and turned against the interests of the community it nominally serves. This depiction was not presented as a prediction. It was presented as a satire of existing conditions, of things the show's writers observed in the world they were living in and rendered in comedic form. But the decades since those episodes aired have produced a great deal of evidence that the show's portrait of captured institutions was not merely satirical, but accurate, and that the mechanisms it depicted, the use of wealth to purchase regulatory immunity, the compromising of local law enforcement, the corruption of local government by the interests of major employers, were not fictional inventions but observed realities rendered in the specific language the show had available. Every episode that depicts Burns evading accountability for his plants violations, that depicts Wigham's police force as an institution that serves power rather than people, that depicts Springfield's government as a body captured by whoever is willing to fund it, was drawing on conditions that existed in the world the writers inhabited. Those conditions have not become less prevalent. If anything, the show's early seasons look less like exaggerated satire and more like understated documentation with each passing year. The episode about social media before social media. Several early Simpsons episodes depicted the specific dynamics of reputation and rumor in a small community in ways that prefigured what those dynamics look like when amplified by social media. The speed of information spread. The way a single moment can define a person in a community's perception, regardless of context. The inability of the affected individual to effectively correct a narrative once it has been established. The way communities use shared narratives to maintain cohesion and manage anxiety. These dynamics existed before social media. They are features of human community organization that the show observed clearly in the 1990s and depicted with enough accuracy that the patterns they described remain recognizable when social media is added as an amplifying mechanism. The show didn't predict social media. It predicted the human behavior that social media would accelerate. The dark implication is that the things social media made worse were already there, already doing damage in smaller and slower and less visible ways, already shaping communities and individual lives in the same patterns that social media would eventually make impossible to ignore. The Simpsons was watching those patterns and noting them long before the tools existed to make them undeniable. The economy of trapped workers? Homer Simpson's relationship to his employer is, across the show's entire run, a depiction of the specific economic trap that emerges when a worker is economically dependent on an employer who treats that dependence as permission for mistreatment. Homer cannot leave. He knows he cannot leave. Burns knows Homer cannot leave. And the knowledge, on both sides of the relationship, shapes everything about how Burns treats Homer and how Homer responds to that treatment. This dynamic was satirical in 1989. It remains satirical, but it has also become the subject of extensive economic research and public discourse about the nature of labor market power, about what happens to workers when their employment options are limited and their employers' options are not, about the specific kinds of harm that emerge from the combination of dependency and indifference. The show depicted these dynamics clearly in a small fictional town. They are features of large, real economies. The prediction is not of any specific event. It is of the specific quality of a working life under conditions of economic dependence, and it is accurate in ways that have become more rather than less visible in the decades since the show began. The dark predictions. Overall, what they mean. The Simpsons' accurate observations about the trajectory of American culture are sometimes celebrated as a kind of achievement, as evidence of the show's intelligence and prescience. But the dark reading of these observations is less celebratory. If the show was accurate, then the things it depicted were already real when it depicted them, or real enough that their development into the futures they described was predictable rather than surprising. The show's predictions are evidence not of supernatural foresight, but of clear-eyed observation of conditions that were already in motion. The things The Simpsons got right about America were not things that happened because the show predicted them. They were things that happened because they were always going to happen given what was already true, and the show saw clearly enough to know it. That clarity is uncomfortable, not because the show was wrong, but because being right about these particular things is not something to feel good about. It means the damage was always coming, and the comedy was one of the ways we managed the knowledge that it was. Number Section 10. The final spiral, late season honesty, and the weight of time. There is a critical consensus that The Simpsons declined after its golden age, which is generally placed somewhere between seasons 3 and 8 or 10, depending on who you ask. The late seasons are considered lesser work, broader, less grounded, more reliant on spectacle and celebrity and the kind of plotting that prioritizes the event over the character. This consensus is not entirely wrong. The late seasons are different from the early ones. The specific quality of writing that defined the show's peak years is not consistently present across season 15 or 20 or 28. But the consensus misses something. In among the episodes that do not work, in among the seasons that feel like a diminished version of what the show once was, there are individual episodes that reach for something as honest and as dark as anything the show produced during its celebrated years. Episodes that have the specific quality of late-period honesty. The honesty of something that has been around long enough to have run out of new ways to be cheerful and has started, almost accidentally, to tell the truth. The Simpsons already did it, and the weight that carries. South Park, in an episode that satirized the feeling of creative exhaustion, had their characters observe repeatedly that whenever they attempted something original, The Simpsons had already done it. This observation was comedic in context, but it pointed to something real about what it means to have been in cultural circulation for 3.5 decades. The show has done almost everything. It has told almost every story available to it. And the late seasons, rather than finding ways to work within this constraint with consistent success, sometimes seem to be straining against it, reaching for novelty and occasionally finding it, but often finding instead the territory that the show's earlier seasons already mapped. The episodes that work in the late seasons tend to be the ones that embrace the constraint rather than fighting it. The ones that acknowledge, sometimes explicitly, that the show and its characters have been in this particular loop for a very long time, and that this acknowledgement is itself a valid subject. The Squirt and the Whale Season 21, Episode 19. A whale beaches itself near Springfield, and the Simpson family becomes deeply invested in its welfare. The episode uses the whale as an emotional canvas, which is a risk, because animals in peril are either the most effective emotional tools available to television or the most manipulative, depending on how they're handled. The episode handles it honestly. The whale dies, not through anyone's negligence or malice, but because the whale is dying and the family's love for it is not sufficient to prevent that death. And the episode allows this outcome without the last-minute rescue that would have been available to an earlier version of the show, without the comedic reversal that would have converted the loss into a joke. Lisa's grief at the whale's death is rendered with the same precision the show brought to her grief at Bleeding Gums Murphy's death 15 seasons earlier. She is 8 years old, and she is learning what she has always been learning in this show, that caring about something does not protect it from being lost. That love and loss are not alternatives but companions, that you cannot have one without eventually encountering the other. The episode's dark gift is in its honesty about this. It does not make the death meaningful in the way that television deaths are usually made meaningful. The whale does not die to teach Lisa something. It dies because it was dying, and Lisa loved it anyway, and now she has to carry that love somewhere that it has nowhere to go. The Bob Next Door Season 21, Episode 22, Sideshow Bob returns in this episode, and what makes the episode worth discussing is not the plot's specific mechanics, but the episode's sense of exhaustion with its own premise. Bob is back. Bart is threatened. The familiar loop repeats, and the episode seems aware, in a way that the show's earlier Bob episodes were not, that this is a loop, that it has been repeating for decades, and that neither participant in the loop has aged or changed or found a way to break the cycle. There is a meta-commentary available in the late Bob episodes that is darker than anything the early Bob episodes intended, simply because of how much time has passed. Bob and Bart have been circling each other for more than 20 years of the show's timeline. Whatever drove the original conflict, whatever personal dynamic began it, has long since been buried under layers of repetition. They are both at this point doing what they do because they do not know how to stop, because the loop has become the relationship, and the relationship has become the loop. Holidays of Future Past Season 23, Episode 9, this is a flash-forward episode, set 30 years in the future, that gives us extended glimpses of what the Simpson family might look like as adults. Bart is a divorced father struggling with his relationship with his children. Lisa is a successful professional who has sacrificed her personal life for her career. Maggie is a famous rock star who communicates primarily through her music. The episode is largely warm and hopeful in its overall tone, but the path to that hope goes through a substantial amount of loss and difficulty. Bart's failure as a husband and his uncertainty as a father. Lisa's loneliness, which has persisted from childhood through adulthood because the world still cannot quite accommodate who she is. The specific weight of being the most capable person in your family and the most alone. What makes this episode belong in this section is what it reveals about the trajectories the show has always been suggesting. Bart becomes what the show's early seasons implied he might, a person of genuine charm and love who is undermined by his own worst impulses and who must do the difficult work of becoming adequate to his responsibilities. Lisa becomes what the show's early seasons suggested she would. Brilliant and isolated and still searching for the specific connection that the world keeps making difficult. These are not comic outcomes. They are honest ones. Recognizing the children we've watched for 36 years and projecting them forward into the adults their experiences were always likely to produce. Bobby, it's cold outside in the late season. Melancholy? The late seasons have a specific quality of melancholy that is different from the darkness of the earlier episodes. It is the melancholy of long familiarity, of having spent a very long time with something and beginning to feel the weight of that duration. The show is aware in its late seasons that it has been going on for a very long time. This awareness occasionally surfaces in the texture of individual episodes as a kind of wistfulness, a sense that the show and its characters are looking back across the distance of their own history, and finding that distance both enormous and strange. This melancholy is not the same as the purposeful darkness of the early and middle seasons. It is softer and more diffuse, but it is real, and it constitutes its own form of honesty. The honesty of something that has been present for long enough to feel the weight of its own presence. The end that never comes and what that means? The Simpsons has not ended. It will probably continue for some time beyond this script's writing, and the fact of its continuation is itself one of the darkest things about it, in the specific way that continuity without resolution can be dark. The characters are still there. They have not grown. They have not changed in any ways that persist. They have not reached the endings that their stories logically imply. Bart at 10 years old, after 36 years, is a statement about the specific form of imprisonment that the loop represents for the characters within it. They cannot end. They cannot resolve. They cannot become what the logic of their stories suggests they should become. They must simply continue. This is played as a feature rather than a bug in the show's public discussion. The floating timeline, the permanent present, the family that is always there when you need them, unchanged, available, constant. And there is something genuinely comforting in that, something that the show has always understood about its relationship with its audience. But the comfort and the darkness are not separate. They are the same thing. The comfort of the unchanging family depends on the imprisonment of the characters within the unchanging present. The characters are comforting to the audience precisely because they are trapped. And that trap is the darkest thing in Springfield, because it is the one that neither the characters nor the audience can acknowledge without dismantling the specific comfort that the show has always provided. The Simpsons doesn't end because we won't let it end. We won't let it end because ending it means admitting that the world it represented has changed, that the version of American family life it depicted belongs to a past that is genuinely past, that the couch on which we all sat watching the opening credits is in a different house now, or in no house at all. The show is a way of refusing that admission, and the refusal costs the characters everything because it costs them time, and time is the only thing that allows a person, even a fictional person, to become something other than what they already are. Number Section 11. The theology of a show that won't die. There is a spiritual dimension to The Simpsons that the show has always engaged with directly, and that becomes more interesting, rather than less, as the show's impossible longevity continues. Homer has met God. This is established canonical fact within the show's universe. He has spoken with God, argued with God, received direct divine communication on multiple occasions. God is a character in The Simpsons, present, accessible, occasionally responsive, and possessed of the specific quality of divine inscrutability that makes God simultaneously intimate and incomprehensible. Ned Flanders, as we have established, has never heard from God. Ned is the show's most devout character, the person most systematically oriented toward divine communication, and the divine has been systematically silent in his direction for 36 years. Homer speaks to God casually, as one speaks to someone they have spent a great deal of time with. Ned prays in a void. This dynamic is theological in a way the show never fully commits to but never abandons. It is saying something about the nature of faith and the nature of grace, and the nature of who receives divine attention, and what it is saying does not resolve into a comfortable theology. Homer the Heretic Season 4, Episode 3. This is the episode where Homer decides not to go to church. He stays home, fries his food, and has the best Sunday of his life. He then has a conversation with God in a dream, in which God and Homer discuss the nature of faith and the specific merits of organized religion in a tone of genuine intellectual openness on both sides. God in this episode is remarkable. He is not the judgmental, thundering God of traditional television religious content. He is curious. He engages with Homer's perspective. He acknowledges the validity of Homer's skepticism about the institutional expression of religion, while also making the case for the value of community and shared practice. He talks to Homer as an equal, or something close to an equal, in a conversation that neither participant tries to win. And then God tells Homer that his time is coming. Not in a threatening way, in a way that sounds almost like preparation, like a gentle heads up that something is approaching that Homer should know is on its way. The coma theory reads this line as prophecy. Season 4, 6 months before the coma episode, God tells Homer his time is coming. Whether you accept the coma reading or not, the line is there, and it is remarkable. The show placed that line in that episode with full awareness of the coma episode that was coming. Whether they intended the connection or not, it exists. And in the dark, at 2 in the morning, it reads very differently than it reads in a brightly lit room during an afternoon rewatch. Lisa the Skeptic Season 9, Episode 8, a skeleton is discovered that appears to be an angel. Springfield responds with mass religious fervor. Lisa, the show's rationalist, insists that the skeleton requires scientific examination rather than theological interpretation. The community resists her insistence with the specific stubbornness of a community that wants the miracle to be real. The episode eventually reveals that the angel skeleton was a marketing stunt. The miracle was manufactured. And Lisa's skepticism was justified by the facts. But watch Lisa in this episode and you will notice something the comedy skips past. Lisa does not want to be right about this. She wants the miracle to be real. She is capable of the same desire for comfort and mystery and divine presence as everyone else in Springfield. She simply cannot allow herself to believe in the absence of evidence, and her inability to believe costs her the comfort that belief would provide. This is Lisa's condition throughout the show. She is constitutionally incapable of accepting comfort that requires abandoning what she knows. And the world she lives in is organized around exactly that kind of comfort. Every institution in Springfield, every community dynamic, every social contract depends on people being willing to set aside what they know in favor of what they need to be true. Lisa cannot do this. She tries, occasionally. But the evidence always surfaces and she is always required to follow it wherever it leads, even when it leads away from comfort. This is its own form of spiritual condition, a faith in reality that is as absolute in its demands as any religious faith and considerably less comfortable in its outcomes. The Simpsons and the nature of grace. Grace, in theological terms, is the unearned gift. The thing given not because you deserve it, but because love doesn't operate on the economy of desert. The Simpsons has been depicting grace for 36 years, and it has been depicting it honestly, which means depicting it as something that arrives inconsistently, that is distributed in ways that have no obvious relationship to merit, and that produces in its recipients not necessarily gratitude but often confusion. Homer receives grace constantly. Burns, who deserves punishment, does not receive justice. Ned, who deserves grace, does not receive it reliably. Lisa, who is the most morally serious person in Springfield, is the one for whom the world offers the most resistance. The distribution of grace in Springfield is not a theological argument. It is a portrait of the distribution of grace in the world, which is uneven and unpredictable and frequently indifferent to questions of merit. The show has always known this. It has depicted it honestly, which means depicting it in a way that produces as much discomfort as comfort, because that is how honest depictions of grace work. The episodes that surface this most clearly are not the religious satire episodes, not the Homer talks to God episodes. They are the quiet episodes where something good happens to someone who didn't expect it, and something bad happens to someone who didn't deserve it, and the show moves on without resolving the theological question those outcomes raise. Because the question has no resolution within the show's universe or outside it. Section 12. Springfield After Dark, the complete portrait. We have been in Springfield for a long time tonight. We have covered Homer's descent and the children's burden, and Marge's quiet suffering, and Burns's architecture of cruelty and the side characters' buried tragedies, and the treehouse's permission structure, and the episodes that handled death honestly and the dark, predictions and the late-season honesty and the theological dimensions, and all of the other threads that compose the second story, the dark story, the story that has been running beneath the comedy for 36 years without ever quite being told in full. What emerges from all of this is not a single coherent argument about what The Simpsons means or what it is trying to say. The show is too large and too internally inconsistent and too dependent on the specific writers in specific rooms in specific years to reduce to a single thesis. It is not a conspiracy. It is not a master plan. It is the accumulated product of hundreds of writers working across 3.5 decades on a franchise that long since exceeded anyone's ability to control its complete meaning. But patterns emerge. They cannot help but emerge across 36 years of sustained engagement with the same characters and the same community and the same basic premise. And the patterns tell a story that the individual episodes, taken in isolation, do not always surface clearly. The story is about a family that loves each other and fails each other and keeps showing up anyway. It is about a community that has organized itself around comfortable lies, because the uncomfortable truth is more than it can bear. It is about the specific weight that ordinary life carries. The weight that is invisible because it is constant. The weight you stop noticing, the same way you stop noticing the background noise of your own heartbeat. The Simpsons is a comedy. It is also, running quietly beneath and through and alongside the comedy, one of the most sustained and honest portraits of American middle-class life that has ever been produced for television. And honesty, when applied to that subject, produces darkness the way water applied to rock produces erosion, slowly, consistently, without drama, until the shape of the thing beneath is finally visible. That is what we have been looking at tonight, the family at the end of everything. If you take all of the evidence that this script has assembled across 12 sections and 4 hours of discussion, and you reduce it to its simplest possible statement, what you arrive at is this. The Simpsons is a family that should not be okay, and keeps being okay anyway. They should not still be together. The stress load that the show has placed on this family across 36 years of plots and crises and disasters and revelations would have fractured most families in the first decade. Homer's failures, Marge's quiet suffering, Bart's damage, Lisa's isolation, the institutional cruelty of the world they live in, the community that cannot be trusted to protect them, the employer who has been systematically harming them for the entire duration of the show's run. These are not forces compatible with the sustained health of a family unit. And yet the family survives. Not because the show insists on happy endings, though it often does. Not because the problems are resolved, because they aren't. They return every week in new forms. But because something at the center of the Simpson family is more durable than the forces working against it. What is that thing? The show answers this question differently in different episodes. Love is the obvious answer, and it is not wrong. Homer loves his family with a totality that his limited cognition cannot fully express, but that is never seriously in doubt. Marge loves her family in a way that constitutes the structural reason the family has not completely fallen apart. The children love each other, imperfectly and intermittently, and in the way that siblings love, which includes genuine affection and regular hostility and the specific bond that comes from having survived the same household. But love is not the complete answer. Love by itself is not sufficient to explain the family's durability. What the show adds to love is something harder to name: a quality of persistence, a refusal to categorize the situation as unrecoverable regardless of how thoroughly it appears to be unrecoverable, a willingness to begin again after every reset, to treat Monday morning's potential as unaffected by what happened on Sunday night. This quality is not wisdom, exactly. Homer and Marge and the children do not always behave wisely. It is not resilience in the conventional sense, because resilience implies learning from adversity, and the family's relationship with learning from adversity is complicated at best. It is something more basic, more biological. The simple insistence on continuing that constitutes the most fundamental act of survival. Springfield is a dark place. The Simpson family's circumstances are, when examined clearly, quite difficult. The comedy is not denial. It is the specific mode in which the family processes the difficulty, the way that laughter and absurdity and the shared experience of something being genuinely, unbelievably ridiculous can coexist with real suffering and genuine love, and the ongoing weight of a life that is harder than the people living it deserve. What we're really watching? When you watch The Simpsons at night, in the dark and the quiet, what you are watching is a family keeping each other company at the end of the day. The show understands this. It has always understood this. The specific comfort it provides is not the comfort of resolution or of order or of a world that makes sense. It is the comfort of company. The feeling that someone else is awake and present and engaged with the ordinary difficulty of being alive. Homer's presence on the screen, his particular voice and his particular way of approaching the world, is comforting not because Homer is competent or wise or because things work out because of him. He is comforting because he is there, because he keeps showing up. Because whatever happens to him across the duration of a given episode, by the end of it he is back on the couch, back in the house, back in the family, ready for the next thing. That readiness is its own kind of heroism, not the dramatic heroism of someone who faces extraordinary challenges with exceptional capabilities. The quiet heroism of someone who faces ordinary challenges with inadequate capabilities and keeps showing up anyway, because the alternative is not showing up, and not showing up is not something Homer Simpson does. Marge keeps the house. Lisa keeps asking questions. Bart keeps pushing against the boundaries that contain him. Maggie keeps watching, keeps gathering, keeps holding what she knows. And Homer keeps coming home at the end of the day to a house that is still standing, because these four people, through some combination of love and stubbornness and the specific grace of families that should not work but somehow do, have kept it standing. This is what the show is about. Not the darkness, though the darkness is real. Not the comedy, though the comedy is genuine, but the persistence, the simple, unremarkable, absolutely extraordinary fact of a family that keeps choosing each other every episode, across every season, through every crisis and reset and catastrophe and discovered truth, choosing each other again. Springfield in the small hours. It is late wherever you are. The day has wound down. The things that needed to be done have either been done or been officially postponed until tomorrow. The room is dark enough that the edges of things are soft. This is the time for Springfield. Not the Springfield of the cultural reference, the show that predicted the future and invented comedy and ran for 36 seasons. The Springfield of the second story, the one running underneath, where a family lives in a town that poisons them and loves each other in spite of everything and keeps the light on in the kitchen long after dark, in case someone is coming home late and needs to be able to see where they're going. The darkness in The Simpsons is not separate from the warmth. It is the condition that makes the warmth necessary. You need light most in the dark. You need family most when the world is difficult. You need comedy most when the truth is too heavy to carry without something to put it in. The show has been doing this for 36 years. Carrying the truth in comedy, keeping the light on in the kitchen, telling the second story alongside the first one, trusting that somewhere in the audience, someone in the dark and the quiet would hear it. If you're here, in the dark, at whatever hour this has found you, then you are that someone. The light in the kitchen is on. The family is home. Number section 13. The episodes that built the darkness slowly. There is a specific category of Simpsons episode that does not announce its darkness. It does not open with a premise that signals difficulty or close with a moment of acknowledged weight. It simply accumulates, over its 22 minutes, a series of details that individually register as comedy and that together produce something that sits differently in the mind after the episode ends than it did while the episode was playing. These are the episodes that built the darkness slowly, that used the show's comedic momentum to carry you somewhere you might not have gone if you had known in advance where you were headed. They are some of the most effective pieces of the show's darker work precisely because their effectiveness depends on the element of surprise, on the moment when you realize that the comedy has been delivering you to something true, and that the truth is not comfortable, and that the episode is not going to soften it for you before the credits roll. Scenes from a Marriage, the recurring background arc. The Simpsons is fundamentally a story about a marriage, and the show has been honest about marriage in ways that are not uniformly cheerful. Homer and Marge's marriage is the show's emotional center, the relationship against which everything else is measured, and the show has returned to it repeatedly across 36 seasons to examine it from different angles and in different states of pressure. What the show has consistently found, when it examines the marriage honestly, is not a relationship in crisis exactly, but one that is in constant low-level negotiation with the gap between what both partners needed and what the marriage could provide. Marge needed to be seen and to be regarded as a full person rather than as a function. Homer needed to be loved unconditionally for what he was, rather than what he was supposed to be. These needs are not incompatible, but they are not automatically satisfied by the fact of the marriage, and the episodes that look most directly at the marriage are the ones where the gap between need and provision is most visible. The episode A Millhouse Divided from Season 8 uses the divorce of Van and Kirk Houghton as a mirror in which Homer and Marge's marriage is reflected. Homer watches another marriage collapse and sees, in the collapse, the specific failures of attention and appreciation and prioritization that could, given the right circumstances, produce the same result in his own marriage. He does not see this in an analytical way, because Homer rarely sees anything in an analytical way. He sees it in the Homer way, which is emotional and imprecise and completely genuine. His response is to repropose to Marge, to offer a new beginning, a restart, a commitment made with the full awareness of what the commitment costs and what the failure to honor it can produce. It is one of Homer's most genuinely romantic gestures, and it is effective and moving within the episode. But the darker reading of the episode is in what prompted it. Homer needed to watch someone else's marriage fail before he could see clearly enough to act in his own. The awareness that his marriage needed attention, that Marge needed to be reminded of why the marriage was worth sustaining, was not available to him from inside his ordinary experience of the marriage. He needed the external reference point of disaster to make the internal condition visible. This is true of Homer in general, and it is true of the marriage in particular. He cannot see it clearly until he is frightened of losing it, and the fear of losing it is what makes him capable of the action that prevents the loss. The marriage is sustained by near misses, by the moments when the gap became visible before it became permanent. This is not a comfortable way to maintain a relationship, and the show has been honest about the discomfort for 36 years. Colonel Homer Season 3, Episode 20. This is an episode about the specific temptation of recognition, about what happens when someone is seen in a way that their usual life does not see them. Homer discovers Lurleen Lumpkin, a waitress with an extraordinary natural gift for country music. He becomes her manager. He invests his attention in her career, in her, in the specific pleasure of being the person who recognized something valuable that nobody else had recognized. And Lurleen, responding to Homer's attention with the natural response of a person who has been largely unseen and is now being seen, falls in love with him. Homer does not recognize what is happening until it has progressed to a point where the recognition becomes unavoidable. This is consistent with Homer's general relationship to the emotional landscape around him. He does not read signals easily. He does not pick up on implications or subtext or the thousand small communications that constitute a person making their feelings known in ways that stop short of direct statement. But when he finally understands what Lurleen's songs have been saying about him, when the lyrics stop being general country sentiment and start being something more specific and more directed, he does the right thing. He tells Marge. He removes himself from the situation. He chooses the marriage over the recognition. The dark thing in this episode is not Homer's brief attraction to the reflected light of Lurleen's admiration. It is what the attraction reveals about what the ordinary marriage does not always provide. Homer needed to feel seen. He needed to feel like someone looked at him and found something worth attention, worth effort, worth the specific kind of care that Lurleen directed at him. Marge provides this imperfectly and inconsistently, not because she does not love him, but because long marriages produce their own forms of invisibility. You stop seeing what is always there. Lurleen saw Homer because she was seeing him for the first time. Marge stopped seeing Homer in the specific way that Lurleen saw him because she has been married to Homer for long enough that the novelty of seeing him has been replaced by the familiarity of knowing him. The familiarity is its own kind of love, but it does not produce the same quality of being seen that novelty produces, and Homer's brief exposure to that quality revealed a need that his ordinary marriage was not meeting. The episode resolves in the direction of the marriage, appropriately and warmly. But what it revealed before the resolution was honest enough to stay in the mind after the warmth has covered it. The Way We Was Season 2, Episode 12. This flashback episode depicts the story of how Homer and Marge met and fell in love, and it is one of the show's most beloved pieces of origin mythology. The love story is genuine, the performances are warm, and the ending, in which the viewer understands that the long marriage visible in the show's present is the fully realized version of what these two young people were building toward, is genuinely moving. But the origin story contains a darkness that is easy to miss when the warmth of the ending covers it. Homer and Marge first connect through a deception. Homer is not enrolled in the remedial English class where they meet. He enrolled specifically because Marge was there, which is romantic in one reading and stalking adjacent in another, depending on how generous you are with the romantic framing. And when Marge discovers this, she is rightfully angry. The connection was built on a false premise. Homer recovers this through genuine effort and genuine feeling, and the love story develops from the recovery. But the foundation of the relationship includes, from the beginning, a Homer who is willing to construct a fiction in order to be near Marge, and a Marge who forgives the construction because the feeling underneath it was real. This sets a template that the show has been exploring across 36 seasons. Homer does something wrong. The wrongness is motivated by love, or something close enough to love to be indistinguishable from it. Marge processes the wrongness and forgives it because the love is real. The marriage sustains itself through this cycle more than it sustains itself through wisdom or foresight or the careful maintenance of communication and mutual regard. It sustains itself because Homer keeps being motivated by love even when the love produces bad behavior, and because Marge keeps choosing to see the love rather than only the bad behavior. This is a complicated model for a relationship. It is also an accurate one for a specific kind of relationship. The kind that endures not because it is well constructed, but because the people in it cannot stop choosing each other, however imperfectly that choosing is executed. Homer defined Season 3, Episode 5. This episode handles the nuclear plant's safety function with a directness that some other episodes approach more obliquely. Homer prevents a meltdown at the plant by pressing a button randomly while panicking, and the episode follows the aftermath of his accidental heroism. The comedy of the episode is in the gap between Homer's actual understanding of what he did, which is essentially nothing, and the public perception of him as a heroic figure whose expertise and presence of mind prevented a catastrophe. He is celebrated. He is given awards. He is presented as evidence that the plant is in capable hands. And the plant is not in capable hands. This has never been in question within the show's universe. Homer's hands are exactly as capable as they have always been, which is to say barely adequate for the minimum requirements of the role, if that. The meltdown was prevented not by skill or knowledge or the application of professional competence, but by a button pressed at random by a man who was too panicked to think clearly. The dark implication, which the comedy of the episode's celebration subplot keeps largely at bay, is the same implication that runs through every episode that involves Homer's actual performance at his actual job. The plant operates continuously. Homer is its safety inspector continuously. The probability that Homer's button pressing has not, in 36 years of continuous employment, actually made things worse rather than better at some point is a probability that the comedy insists upon while the dark logic of the premise refuses to confirm. The celebration of Homer as a safety hero is the comedic expression of the dark truth. The mechanism that is supposed to protect Springfield from nuclear catastrophe is Homer Simpson. The show has been saying this, through comedy, for 36 years. In the dark, the comedy drops away, and what remains is the sentence. The mechanism that is supposed to protect Springfield from nuclear catastrophe is Homer Simpson. Lisa's Wedding Season 6, Episode 19. This flash-forward episode shows Lisa as a 23-year-old woman engaged to an Englishman named Hugh, living in what appears to be a successful and cosmopolitan future. She has achieved, by external measures, exactly the kind of life her intelligence and her ambition were always building toward. And she is not quite happy. The episode does not say this directly. The surface story is a romance plot, a question of whether Hugh will be able to accept Lisa's family. The specific cultural gulf between the refined future Lisa and the perpetually Homerish Homer of any timeline. This is handled with warmth and comedy and a genuinely sweet ending. But the episode is darker than the surface story when you attend to what it reveals about Lisa's future self. She has distanced herself from her family in the way that people who come from complicated families sometimes do, not with hostility, but with the specific, careful management of emotional distance that allows proximity without the full vulnerability of closeness. She loves them. She is not sure what to do with them. The scene between future Lisa and Homer is the episode's darkest and most honest piece of work. Homer says something clumsy and Homerish that reveals his limitations clearly, and Lisa's face in that moment contains something that the episode is honest enough to hold for a second before resolving it. She loves him and she is frustrated by him, and she is, at 23 years old, still working out how to hold both of those things at the same time, which is the same work she was doing at 8 years old, and which may never be fully resolved. The episode ends with Lisa keeping the family over the relationship, which is the appropriate ending for the show's internal mythology. Hugh cannot accept the Simpsons and Lisa will not ask the Simpsons to change. The love for the imperfect family wins over the love for the refined relationship. This is the show saying something true about the specific quality of family loyalty, how it operates even when it costs you something, how it persists even when it would be easier and more comfortable to create distance. But in creating that ending, the episode also creates the future in which Lisa is alone again, the relationship sacrificed, still at 23 working out the same problems she was working out at 8, still finding the world incompletely able to accommodate who she is. Number, Section 14. The Weight of 36 Years. There is something that happens to a show after 36 years that does not happen after 5 or 10 or even 20. The weight of its own duration becomes a subject. The accumulated context of everything that preceded any given episode becomes part of the meaning of that episode in ways that earlier seasons could not have anticipated, and that no individual episode can fully manage. When you watch a contemporary Simpsons episode, you are not watching the episode in isolation. You are watching it with the accumulated history of the show behind it, all the versions of these characters you have known across decades, all the stories that have been told and the ones that have been left incomplete, the specific quality of familiarity that comes from having spent more time with a fictional family than with some real ones. This accumulated weight is not simply nostalgia, though nostalgia is part of it. It is something more complex, a form of relationship that television rarely produces because most television does not last long enough to produce it. The Simpsons has been around long enough to have become part of the texture of life for a significant portion of its audience, the way that certain books or certain songs become part of the texture of life, embedded in specific memories and specific emotional associations that accumulate across the years. The specific grief of the familiar, The darkness that comes from 36 years of familiarity is a specific kind of darkness, different from the darkness in any individual episode, and different from the darkness of the show's themes. It is the darkness of knowing that the children you have watched grow up across 36 years have not grown up, that the parents you have watched navigate their marriage across 36 years have not aged, that the town you have visited weekly for most of your life is exactly where it was when you first arrived, unchanged by the weight of all the time that has passed in your life outside of it. Springfield is frozen and you are not. You have aged. The people you watched the show with when you were young have changed, or have left your life, or have died. The world has changed in ways that Springfield has tracked but not inhabited. And every week, when the couch gag plays, and the family assembles, and the episode begins, there is this specific moment of temporal dislocation, of encountering something that is exactly as you left it in a world that has not been exactly as you left it anywhere else. This dislocation is part of the show's comfort and part of its darkness simultaneously. The same quality of unchangingness that makes it comforting to return to, the fact that it is always there, always the same, always ready to resume exactly where it left off regardless of how much time has passed outside its frame, is also the quality that marks the distance between its frozen time and your moving time. Every episode you watch is evidence of how many episodes you have watched before it, which is to say, evidence of how much of your life has passed in the company of this particular fiction. Homer at the end of his working life? The show has never depicted Homer's retirement. It has never depicted the end of his working life at the plant, because the plant is not a place Homer can leave within the show's internal logic, and the working life that sustains the family is not something the show can afford to let end. But consider what a genuine Homer retirement episode would look like if the show were willing to go there. Homer at 65 or 70, if the show allowed its characters to age, the plant behind him. Burns presumably still there, because Burns does not age in any meaningful way, maintained by his treatments and his infrastructure. The children grown and gone. Marge in the house on Evergreen Terrace, still there, still the constant that she has always been. Homer retired, suddenly free of the obligation that has structured every working day of his adult life, free of the specific requirement to be somewhere at a specific time and to perform a specific function, free to be whoever he is when the function is removed. We have visited this territory, briefly, in King-Size Homer. We know, in outline, what that person looks like. He is the person who watches television and eats and does not miss the job in the way that people who chose their jobs miss them when those jobs end. He is the person for whom retirement is not a transition to leisure, but a removal of structure, and the removal of structure reveals the absence of an interior life that the structure was concealing. But we also know, from 36 years of watching Homer, that there is something underneath the absence, the moments of genuine joy, the genuine love for his family, the occasional and surprising capacity for grace. The retirement Homer, in the honest version of the episode the show has never made, would be the full complexity of everything the show has shown us about him, concentrated in the specific circumstances of a man who has finally run out of obligations and must find out what he is without them. That episode is the darkest Simpsons episode that has never been made. Not because Homer would be sad, exactly, but because what would be visible in the retirement, without the comedy of the job and the plant and the daily failures, is the full picture of what 36 years of Homer Simpson has been building toward, which is an ordinary man who loved his family imperfectly and worked at a job he did not choose and kept showing up every morning and never quite became whatever he might have been under different circumstances. And who is that? Finally. Just that. Nothing more and nothing less. A man at the end of his working life in the house on Evergreen Terrace with the woman he loves and the accumulated weight of everything he did and did not do, in the town that was always both his home and his prison, which is the same thing, in the end, for most people in most places. Lisa at the age of her promise? Lisa, if the show allowed its characters to age, would be in her mid-40s by now. The 8-year-old who played the saxophone and fought for environmental protection and read books above her grade level and wept at the train station when Mr. Bergstrom left, that child would be a middle-aged woman. What kind of middle-aged woman? The flash-forward episodes have given us partial answers, but they are answers within the show's specific optimistic mythology, which tends toward the version where Lisa's intelligence and her convictions have been vindicated. The honest answer is more complicated. The intelligent children who carry the burden of seeing clearly in environments that reward not seeing clearly are not uniformly served by the adulthood that follows. Some of them find their people, find the specific communities and contexts that can receive what they have to offer, and the years of isolation are retroactively converted by this finding into a necessary prelude rather than a permanent condition. Others carry the isolation into adulthood because the adult world turns out to be more complicated than the promise of adulthood suggested, more like Springfield than like the elsewhere that childhood intelligence dreams of. Lisa at 44 is either one of these people or the other, and the show has never quite committed to which one she is, because committing would require the show to tell a story about time that the floating timeline prevents it from telling. She is frozen at 8 years old. The promise is frozen at 8 years old. And in the freezing, the promise is both preserved and prevented from being tested. This is one of the darkest things about the floating timeline, when you look at it from a specific angle. It preserves the promise of the children by preventing the children from growing into the adults who would either redeem or complicate that promise. Lisa at 8 is brilliant and passionate and full of conviction, and the world has not yet had time to demonstrate whether those qualities are sufficient to sustain her. She gets to remain at the moment before the demonstration, perpetually in possession of the unearned credential of her potential. And there is a grief in that, a grief that the show cannot quite name because naming it would require acknowledging the suspension, which would require acknowledging the loop, which would require the show to look directly at what it is doing to the characters it loves. The loop as the show's central tragedy? Every theory about The Simpsons that we have encountered across this script, the radiation theory and the coma theory and the collective denial theory and the floating timeline, arrives at the same central image. Characters trapped in a loop that they cannot break free of, cannot see clearly from inside, cannot escape without the destruction of the specific conditions that make their lives what their lives are. Homer is trapped by his economic dependence and his limited cognition and the accumulated weight of damage that the plant and Springfield and Burns and his own history have done to him. Marge is trapped by the specific requirements of the role she has chosen and by the love that makes the requirements feel worth meeting. Bart is trapped by the 10-year-old version of himself that the show cannot allow to age into something different. Lisa is trapped by the 8-year-old version of herself and by the impossibility of Springfield actually containing who she is. Maggie is trapped by 1-year-old, the permanent infancy that the show needs her to maintain. Burns is trapped by the century-long infrastructure of his own survival, maintained at the cost of every quality that might make survival feel worthwhile. Smithers is trapped by his devotion to a man who will never give him what the devotion has earned. The side characters are trapped by their roles in the comedy, by the specific functions they serve in the show's narrative machinery, by the need of the format to have them available in fixed and recognizable forms. And we, the audience, are trapped too, trapped by our affection, by the specific comfort that the show's unchangingness provides, by the investment of decades of attention that makes it impossible to simply stop, to let the family go, to accept that the story we have been watching for 36 years does not have an ending, because endings require time to pass, and time passing requires the show to become something other than what it is. The loop is everybody's prison and everybody's home. The darkness is inseparable from the warmth. The unchangingness that makes us feel comforted is the same unchangingness that prevents the characters from becoming what their stories imply they could become. We chose this. We press play. We keep them frozen. We keep showing up every week to make sure the family is still there, still together, still in the house on Evergreen Terrace, with the couch and the television, and the specific arrangement of people that has been the show's premise for 36 years. The loop continues because we maintain it. And every time we watch, every time we laugh, every time we feel the specific warmth of returning to something that is always exactly where we left it, we tighten the loop a little more. We make it harder for the Simpsons to escape. We make it harder for ourselves to escape. We become Springfield, in the specific way that you become the places and the stories you spend enough time inside of, until the boundary between outside and inside stops being clear. Number section 15. The 4 a.m. Simpsons. There is a specific quality to watching The Simpsons at 4 in the morning that is different from watching it at any other time. The late-night context strips away the social dimension of television watching. There is no one to laugh with. The jokes land without the amplification of company, which means the jokes that genuinely work land harder, because they are landing directly, without mediation, And the jokes that work through social consensus, the shared recognition humor that is funnier because you are watching it with someone who also recognizes what is being recognized, those jokes find less purchase. What remains at 4 in the morning in the dark is the texture of the thing itself. The animation, which at this hour and in this light reveals a kind of beauty that the daytime viewing experience sometimes obscures. The specific quality of the voice performances, which the show's actors brought to their roles with a consistency across decades that is one of the quiet miracles of television, and which at 4 in the morning carries a warmth that is almost physical. The music, which the show's composers always took more seriously than the comedy format strictly required, which at this hour sounds like something from a more serious genre than the genre it serves. And the stories. The stories at 4 in the morning are the ones we have been discussing throughout this entire script. They are the stories in the spaces between the jokes, the second story running beneath the comedy, the dark thing that the warmth has always been keeping company with. At 4 in the morning, the comedy and the darkness are not in opposition. They are not alternatives, one covering the other, or one emerging when the other retreats. They are the same thing, seen from different angles. The specific quality of Homer's stupidity at 4 in the morning is both funnier and sadder than it is at any other time, because at 4 in the morning you can see both the joke and the truth that the joke is built on simultaneously, without having to choose which one to attend to. This is why The Simpsons is 4 in the morning television. Not because it is dark, exactly, or because it is deep, exactly, or because it was designed to reward the specific combination of reduced defenses and quiet attention that 4 in the morning produces, but because it is honest, and honesty, at 4 in the morning, when the day's performances have all been concluded, and the energy for sustaining them has been exhausted, and all that is left is the person you actually are in the absence of any audience, honesty lands differently. The Springfield you see at 4 in the morning is the Springfield that was always there. The family you see is the family that was always there. The darkness and the warmth are both exactly as they have always been, and at 4 in the morning you can hold them both without the need to resolve the tension between them into something more comfortable. The small moments. The Simpsons' darkness is not primarily in its episodes about crisis. It is in the small moments, the background details, the frames between the plot-relevant frames where something is visible in a character's face or in the texture of a space that the comedy's momentum does not quite carry away. The moment where Homer looks at his workstation at the plant, just for a second, with an expression that is not quite anything the episode requires him to feel. The moment where Marge stands in a clean kitchen, surrounded by evidence of her labor, and her face is the face of a person who is alone in a room, even though she is almost never alone. The moment where Bart walks home from school with a quality of solitude that the episode will not address but that the animation captures anyway, in the set of his shoulders and the direction of his eyes. The moment where Lisa sits down to practice the saxophone and before she starts playing, there is a breath, a settling, a preparation for the one thing she does that is entirely hers, and in that preparation there is a loneliness and a readiness that coexist in exactly equal measure. These moments accumulate. They are not what the episodes are about. They are what the episodes contain, in the spaces between the content, in the margins of the comedy. And at 4 in the morning, in the dark, they are visible, in a way they are not always visible at noon. The show is full of them, 36 years of them, 800 episodes of small moments where the truth of these characters' lives surfaced briefly in the space between the jokes before the next joke covered it over. Small moments of genuine feeling, genuine beauty, genuine honesty, embedded in what was always presenting itself as something lighter. They were always there. They are always there. And if you have been watching, really watching, with the specific quality of attention that the dark and the quiet makes possible, you have been seeing them for as long as you have been watching the show. You were seeing them tonight. What we owe the show? The Simpsons has given us something extraordinary. Not just the comedy, though the comedy has been extraordinary. Not just the cultural impact, though the cultural impact has been significant and far-reaching, and in some ways genuinely formative for the generations that grew up with it. What the show has given us is a sustained and honest account of a particular kind of life, rendered in the specific form of comedy, available to anyone who wanted to look past the comedy to the account. Most people looked at the comedy, and the comedy was worth looking at. The comedy was brilliant and inventive and genuinely funny in ways that television rarely achieves, and the decision to watch it as comedy was entirely reasonable. But the other thing was always there, the account. The honest, sustained, imperfect, occasionally breathtaking account of what it is to be the people the Simpsons are, in the place they are, in the circumstances they are, across the time the show has given them. That account is what we have been reading together tonight. And what we owe the show after reading it is the acknowledgement that it was doing something harder and more valuable than making us laugh. That behind the couch gag and the guest stars and the catchphrases and the cultural phenomenon, there was always a family doing their best in difficult circumstances, and a show that was honest about both the doing their best and the difficult. The Simpsons did not just make us laugh, it made us see. It showed us, in the language of comedy and across 36 years of weekly visits to Springfield, something true about what ordinary life costs and what it provides, and what it means to keep choosing it anyway, every morning, every episode, every season. The loop continuing, because the loop is what love looks like when it does not have the option of being anything else. That is what the show was doing. That is what it has always been doing. And the darkness we have been exploring tonight is not separate from the love. It is the condition in which the love operates. The darkness is what makes the love visible, the way stars are only visible against the dark of space, the way warmth is only felt in contrast to cold. Springfield is dark. The Simpsons love each other anyway. The loop continues. The couch is always there. Number section 16. What stays when the comedy fades? An episode of The Simpsons is 22 minutes long. You watch it, and the comedy is present throughout, doing its work, keeping things moving, converting the difficult into the manageable. The episode ends. The credits roll. And then, in the subsequent hours, something happens that is different from what happens after most television. The jokes fade. The comedic set pieces lose their immediacy. The voice of the episode becomes quieter in your memory. And what remains, when the comedy has receded, is the thing underneath the comedy. The mood. The specific quality of feeling that the episode produced, separate from any specific joke or plot point. The residue of the truth that was running beneath everything. With some Simpsons episodes, the residue is warmth. The episode's emotional work was constructive, building towards something that feels like affirmation or hope, or the specific comfort of a story that ended the way you needed it to end. These episodes leave you feeling held. With other episodes, the residue is something else. A weight, a quiet, uncomfortable awareness. The specific discomfort of having seen something true about a subject you would prefer not to have to see clearly. These episodes leave you feeling honest, which is not always the same as feeling good. The episodes we have discussed tonight are mostly of the second type. They are the episodes that produce, in their wake, the residue of honesty. They are the episodes that, at 4 a.m. in the dark, sit in the room with you after they have ended, neither demanding attention nor providing comfort, simply being present the way that truth tends to be present, quietly, patiently, without apology. The Simpsons as a form of company, what the show provides, at its most essential level, is company. This is true of the comedy, which is the company of shared recognition, the specific warmth of laughing at the same thing with a vast, invisible, distributed community of people who are watching the same show in their own rooms and finding the same things funny for the same reasons. But it is also true of the darkness of The Simpsons. The second story we have been reading tonight provides a specific form of company that is perhaps more valuable and certainly more rare. The company of honest witness. The company of a story that sees the difficulty of your situation clearly enough to name it, that does not insist on the resolution that would make the difficulty more comfortable to acknowledge, that stays with you in the realistic version of things rather than the improved version. The Simpsons, at its best, is the kind of company that says, yes, that is what it is like, and does not immediately add, but here is why it will get better, or here is what you should do, or here is the lesson that converts the difficulty into wisdom. It just says yes, and in the middle of the night, when the options for comfort are limited and the things that normally soften reality are all either unavailable or insufficient, that yes is worth a great deal. The family that stays, Homer is still there. He will be there next week and the week after, and as far forward as anyone can reasonably project the show's future. He will be standing in the doorway of the house on Evergreen Terrace, or on the couch, or at the table, or at his workstation at the plant, exactly as he has always been, with the specific quality of presence that 36 years of watching has made as familiar as anything in our actual lives. Marge is still there, Lisa is still there, Bart is still 10, and Lisa is still 8, and Maggie is still 1, and the loop is still running, the family still choosing each other every episode, the house still standing on Evergreen Terrace in the town that is not on any map, and is simultaneously every American town you have ever known. This is what the darkness of The Simpsons ultimately amounts to, if you hold all of it together and look at what shape it makes. It is the darkness of something that persists, of something that refuses to end, of a family that should have collapsed under the weight of everything the show has loaded onto them, and that has not collapsed, that comes back every week, that is still there when you return to it regardless of how long you have been away. The persistence is the message. The loop continuing is the answer to every dark question the show has raised across its run, every implication of damage and inadequacy and institutional failure and personal limitation and accumulated loss. The answer is not a resolution. The answer is not a lesson or a moral or a moment of triumphant clarity. The answer is the family being there next week. Still there, still together, still choosing each other in the specific, imperfect way that love looks when it has been living in close quarters with difficulty for 36 years. That is The Simpsons. That has always been The Simpsons. The darkness and the staying together are not alternatives. They are the same story. And the story has been going on for 36 years. And it will go on for as long as we keep watching. And every time we watch, we are part of the loop. We are the audience that holds the family in its frozen present. We are the ones who will not let them go. And maybe that is the right choice. Maybe the right response to something that loves you, even imperfectly, even through the medium of comedy and animation and the specific awkward grace of Homer Simpson stumbling through another episode, maybe the right response is to keep showing up, to keep watching, to let it keep you company in the dark. The family is still there, the light is on in the kitchen, the loop continues. You can sleep now. That was 4 hours in Springfield. More than 36 years of the show, more than 800 episodes, all of it building toward the specific thing we have been exploring tonight. The dark story, the honest one, the one that was always running underneath the comedy. Number section 17. The episodes that hurt the most. There is a subset of Simpsons episodes that fans who have watched the show since childhood report returning to with a complicated mixture of feelings. These are not necessarily the episodes that are rated most highly by critics or that are most frequently cited in discussions of the show's best work. They are the episodes that hit something personal, that landed on a specific frequency of experience that was too accurately rendered to be entirely comfortable. These are the episodes that hurt the most, not in a dramatic way, not in the way that a catastrophic episode of a prestige drama hurts. In the quiet, specific way, that recognition hurts when you recognize something you would prefer not to have recognized. The principle of recognizing yourself, The Simpsons works, at its most fundamental level, through the mechanism of recognition. You recognize Homer because you recognize the specific quality of a person who keeps finding themselves in situations that their better judgment would have prevented if their better judgment were slightly better developed or more consistently applied. You recognize Marge because you recognize the specific quality of a person who is holding everything together with a patience that is not inexhaustible, but that has not yet been exhausted. You recognize the children because you remember being the children, or you recognize your children in the children, or both. Recognition is usually pleasurable. It is the pleasure of being seen, of finding that something you thought was private or unusual or specific to you has actually been captured in a form you can share with everyone who encounters the same work. Recognition says, you are not alone in this. Other people have been here. The person who made this was here too. But recognition is not always pleasurable. Sometimes it catches something specific and accurate enough to produce not pleasure, but exposure. The feeling of being seen more clearly than you wanted to be seen by a piece of art that was not even specifically addressing you, that was addressing a general condition and happened to nail the specific version of it that you live in. The Simpsons has been producing this kind of recognition for 36 years. Not in every episode, not consistently or predictably, but with enough frequency, across enough seasons, touching enough of the experience of being a person in an ordinary life with a family and a job and a town and all the specific complications that those things bring, that most people who have watched the show seriously have had at least one moment of being seen more clearly than comfortable. Homer's Brain, the episode as Mirror, Home, the episode where Homer's crayon is removed and his intelligence restored, functions differently for different viewers depending on where they sit in relation to Homer's fundamental cognitive situation. For viewers who identify with Lisa, who see themselves as the intelligent person in a family or community that cannot fully receive their intelligence, the episode is about the cost of seeing clearly, and the cost is rendered accurately enough to produce the specific recognition of having paid it or expected to pay it. For viewers who identify with Homer, who see in Homer's cheerful, limited engagement with the world something that resonates with their own relationship to life's complexity, the episode is darker, because it raises the possibility, rendered in comedic form but with an accuracy that the comedy does not entirely dissolve, that the distance between what you understand and what you could understand might be the product of something that was done to you or that happened to you, rather than something constitutive of who you are. Homer chose the crayon. He chose it consciously, with full knowledge of what the choice meant. And the show presents this as both comedy and a genuine act of self-knowledge. The recognition that the cleared-away version of himself was not a version of himself he could sustain in the life he was actually living. He was not capable of being the intelligent Homer in Springfield. Springfield was not capable of being the place that intelligent Homer could inhabit. This is the most honest the show ever got about the relationship between a person and their environment, about the way that environments can make certain ways of being possible and other ways of being impossible, about the cost of clarity in contexts that are not organized to accommodate it. And it is rendered in the specific form of a man voluntarily putting a crayon back in his own brain, which is the show's characteristic move, taking a genuine and uncomfortable truth and rendering it in a form so absurd that the absurdity can contain the discomfort just barely, just enough. The Lisa episodes that hurt specifically. There are several Lisa episodes that have a specific quality of hurt for viewers who grew up as the smart kid, the one whose intelligence was simultaneously their most valued trait and the primary source of their isolation, who spent their childhood being recognized for capability while being excluded from the social warmth that comes from being simply relatable. Lisa Gets an A is a late-season episode, Season 10, that handles academic dishonesty with a specificity that is recognizable to anyone who has ever been in the specific position of being expected to succeed by everyone around them and failing for once to do so. Lisa cheats on a test. The cheating works. Her grade saves the school's academic funding. She must then navigate the impossibility of confessing when the confession would harm everyone she was trying to protect by cheating. The specific trap of the episode, the trap that Lisa is caught in, is the trap of excellence in a system that has organized itself around your excellence without fully accounting for what that organization costs you. Lisa is expected to be excellent always. The expectation is not cruel. It emerges from genuine recognition of her capabilities. But the expectation removes the option of failure in a way that makes failure more rather than less likely to produce crisis when it occurs, because failure is not supposed to be an option for Lisa, and when it happens in a context that cannot accommodate it. This is the specific recognition that hurts in the Lisa episodes, for viewers who know it from inside. The weight of being the capable one, the expectation that comes with capability, the specific impossibility of being allowed to fail or to be ordinary, or to not know something, in a context where your being capable has become load-bearing for the people around you. The Bart episodes that hurt most specifically tend to be the ones about belonging and its absence, about the specific experience of being a kid who does not fit the categories that the school and the family and the town have prepared for people like him. Bart is not unintelligent in any real sense. He is differently oriented, differently energized, differently motivated than the categories the school has prepared for him. He learns in ways the school does not teach. He is capable of extended commitment and sophisticated planning when the subject is one that engages his specific interest. He can be loyal to a degree that exceeds almost everyone else in his age group. He can be kind in sudden, undefended moments that the show renders with a precision that is somehow more moving than the prepared kindness of better-behaved characters. And yet the school consistently fails him. The assessment system consistently categorizes him as a failure. The structures designed to support children's development consistently treat him as someone to be managed rather than someone to be met. And Bart, adapting to these categorizations with the practical intelligence that is his most consistent characteristic, accepts the failure label and builds an identity around it that is at once protective and constraining. The episodes that hurt most specifically in this register are the ones where Bart's actual capabilities are briefly visible before being covered over again by the failure narrative. The episodes where you see clearly that the kid the school says is failing is not the kid who is actually there. These episodes are dark not because they are about bad outcomes, but because they are about potential that is consistently untapped, about a person being received as less than they are, about the specific sadness of capability that exists in a form no one around you knows how to recognize. The Marge episodes that hurt specifically. There are Marge episodes, fewer of them than the Homer or Lisa or Bart episodes, that have the specific quality of recognition for viewers who know from the inside what it is to be the person in a system who provides the function without being seen to provide it, who manages the things that would break if not managed without anyone registering the management as work, whose contribution is visible only in its absence. 1 in a Million, from Season 13, is not primarily a Marge episode but contains a Marge thread that is worth noting in this context. Marge briefly achieves recognition for a contribution she made to a community effort, recognition that is genuinely offered and genuinely meant, and her response to the recognition reveals how unfamiliar it is, how little practice she has had in receiving it, how the specific experience of being seen for something she did is sufficiently unusual that she does not quite know what to do with it. The recognition thread is played for light comedy in the episode, but the comedy is riding on something real, on the accurate observation that people who do essential invisible work and are not thanked for it often find, when they are finally thanked, that the experience of being thanked is disorienting rather than simply pleasant. Because the thank you implies that the work was something someone noticed, which implies that the not thanking before was also a form of choice, which raises questions that are uncomfortable to consider too directly. Number. Section 18. The Neighborhood of Impossible Things. Springfield is geographically impossible. We have established this. The town exists somewhere and nowhere, bordered by states that are inconsistent with each other, containing geographic features that cannot coexist in any real American location. It is a neighborhood of impossible things, rendered in the show's specific visual vocabulary of yellow skin and 4 fingers and buildings that shift subtly in proportion between shots. But the physical impossibility of Springfield is the most visible instance of a broader impossibility that pervades the show's universe. Springfield operates on rules that are slightly different from the rules of the physical and social world outside it, and those differences are not random or decorative. They are expressive. They are the show saying, in the language of its own internal reality, something about the nature of the experience it is depicting. The impossible recoveries? Homer survives things that no human body could survive. This has been established many times and in many registers across the show's run. From the relatively minor to the genuinely extraordinary. He falls from significant heights. He is struck by vehicles. He is subjected to electrical shocks at levels that should be fatal. He walks away from explosions. He recovers from injuries that would require months of hospitalization for anyone operating under normal biological constraints. This impossibility is part of the show's comedic language. Cartoon characters are resilient in a way that their flesh and blood counterparts are not, and the impossibility of Homer's physical recoveries is a feature of the genre rather than a statement about Homer specifically. It is what allows the show to put Homer in jeopardy week after week without those jeopardies accumulating into consequences that would change the nature of the character or the show. But within the logic of the theories we have been exploring throughout this script, the impossible recoveries carry a different kind of meaning. They are either the consequence of Homer's radiation-altered biology, which has made him nearly indestructible at the cost of his cognitive function, or they are the consequence of Homer dreaming, which means that nothing is actually happening to his body because his body is not in Springfield. Or they are the consequence of Springfield's collective agreement to not notice what is actually happening, which extends from the social realm into the physical realm, in ways that the show has always made slightly too absurd to be entirely dismissible. The impossible recoveries are the show's most consistent reminder that Springfield does not operate on normal rules. And the reminder, in the dark and the quiet, is one of the show's most persistent sources of unease. The town that rebuilds. Springfield has been destroyed multiple times. It has been rebuilt, in every case, with a completeness and a speed that no actual community that had experienced comparable destruction would achieve. The buildings return. The infrastructure is restored. The catastrophe is absorbed. And by the following week, when the episode that depicted the destruction is far enough in the past to have been officially incorporated into Springfield's impossible continuity, The town looks exactly as it always looked. The rebuilding is part of the show's format. Weekly episodic television requires a reset because the format cannot accumulate damage indefinitely without changing its own nature in ways that are difficult to sustain. The reset is a production reality. But the reset is also, within the logic of the show's universe, the most extraordinary thing that happens in Springfield on a regular basis. A community has an experience that should alter it permanently, and it is altered for exactly as long as the episode in which the experience occurred, and then it is not altered anymore, and the alteration is available only in the archive of the episode, accessible to viewers but not to residents. The residents of Springfield live in a town that resets, that absorbs catastrophe without accumulating it, that experiences things and does not become different things because of the experiences. This is the specific quality of Springfield that is most difficult to explain through any single theory, and that all the theories together are trying to account for, each from a different direction, each arriving at a different explanation for the same impossible pattern. The radiation theory says the cognitive damage from decades of contamination prevents the residents from maintaining the memory of what happened long enough for it to alter their behavior. The coma theory says Homer's dreaming brain cannot sustain permanent change because change requires a continuity of selfhood that sleep interrupts. The collective denial theory says the community is actively choosing not to remember, for the reasons that the principal and the pauper episode makes explicit. The floating timeline says the reset is structural rather than narrative, a feature of the show's form rather than a statement about the show's content. None of these explanations is sufficient by itself. All of them together are more than sufficient to explain the pattern, which means the pattern is overdetermined, which means the show has built more justification for the impossible reset than any single theory requires. As though the writers knew at some level that the reset was the most honest thing about the show, the most accurate reflection of something real, and they built multiple explanations for it because the reality they were reflecting deserved multiple accounts. The real Springfield. There is a reading of The Simpsons that sees Springfield not as a fictional town in an animated show, but as a portrait of a real condition, the condition of American working-class life in the late 20th and early 21st century, rendered in the specific language that animation and comedy make available. In this reading, the yellow skin, and the four fingers, and the impossible recoveries, and the institutional failures, and the unresolvable personal difficulties are not exaggerations of reality. They are the specific artistic language through which a specific reality is described, the way that poetry uses compression and metaphor to describe emotional experiences that plain language cannot fully capture. The people of Springfield are damaged in ways they cannot fully see or articulate, living in a community that has been arranged to serve the interests of the powerful at the expense of the many, performing their lives with a resilience that looks, from outside, like acceptance, but that is actually the specific adaptation of people who have limited options and have learned to live well within those limits. This is not a metaphor for something else. This is an accurate description of a genuine social condition. The show has been describing it, in the language of animated comedy, for 36 years. And the darkness of the show, the specific quality of darkness we have been exploring throughout this script, is the darkness of that condition when it is seen clearly. The darkness is not the show's invention. It is the reality the show is depicting, rendered in the form that allows it to be seen. The comedy is the form. The darkness is the content. And the choice to render the darkness in the form of comedy is the show's deepest statement, that the darkness of ordinary American life, the darkness of loving your family imperfectly and working your body for wages that do not compensate the cost, the darkness of a community that has been captured by power and does not have the resources to challenge it, that this darkness is not tragedy in the classical sense. It is not something that demands the specific register of tragic form. It is something more ordinary than tragedy. It is something that happens to ordinary people in ordinary circumstances, and that ordinary people navigate with a combination of humor and persistence and love and the specific kind of grace that does not announce itself because it has never been taught to announce itself. It is the darkness of people who find ways to live inside circumstances that should not be survivable, and that are survived anyway, day after day, episode after episode, loop after loop. Springfield is dark. The Simpsons are there anyway. We are there with them. The loop continues. Number section 19. The episodes nobody talks about. Every conversation about The Simpsons eventually settles into the same canon of referenced episodes. Homer at the bat, Cape Fear, Marge versus the monorail. You only move twice. The one with the hummingbird, the one with the pony, the one with the crayon. These episodes are great, and the conversation about them is not wrong to keep returning to them. They are great in the ways that are most visible, the ways that produce quotable lines and shareable moments, and the specific pleasures of comedy at its most confident and precise. But there is a second tier of Simpsons episodes that does not get referenced in these conversations. Not because the episodes are worse, but because the things they do well are harder to quote and harder to share and harder to explain in the terms that the internet has developed for discussing the show. These episodes work in slower registers, through accumulation and texture, rather than through the perfect joke landing at the perfect moment. They are the episodes you remember not as specific scenes but as specific feelings. You remember that they were there. You remember roughly what they were about. And you remember, sometimes with surprising clarity, what they felt like. Selma's Choice Season 4, Episode 13. This episode divides its attention between two plots that seem initially unrelated: Homer's illness, which is dramatic and then comedic, and Selma's realization, slow and then sudden and then quiet, in the way that real realizations tend to be, that she wants a child, and that the window for having one may be closing. The Homer plot is the louder of the two, funnier, more kinetic, more immediately satisfying as comedy, but the Selma plot is the one that stays. Selma is not a character the show has historically treated with complexity. She and Patty are primarily comedic presences in Marge's life, slightly menacing toward Homer, sardonic about men in general, useful for contrast and for specific comic rhythms, but not usually centers of genuine dramatic weight. This episode treats Selma as a full person, briefly, with the specific completeness that the show manages when it decides to give a side character their due. She watches Bart and Lisa at the amusement park, standing in for the parent she has not become. She makes decisions about what her life will include. She arrives at an accommodation with herself, sitting at the end of the episode with her iguana and her television, in an apartment that is hers, that contains what her life contains. No more and no less. The ending is not sad in a declarative way. The show does not tell you it is sad. It simply shows you Selma in her apartment, settling in, and leaves you to feel whatever you feel about it, which is the most sophisticated thing it could have done. The comedy of the episode has been the scaffolding. What the scaffolding was holding was Selma's actual life, and the scaffolding comes down at the end, and what remains is the life. Homer's Triple Bypass Season 4, Episode 11. Homer has a series of cardiac events and requires open-heart surgery that the family cannot afford. This is the episode's premise, and it is played, in the show's characteristic way, as a mixture of genuine alarm and comedy, the comedy providing cover for the alarm, and the alarm providing ballast for the comedy. The darkness of this episode is not in the surgery. It is in the economics. The family cannot pay for Homer's surgery at the prices the hospital charges, and the resolution of this financial impossibility is Dr. Nick Riviera, whose medical credentials are, at best, ambiguous, performing the surgery for a reduced rate. This is both very funny and very honest about the specific category of desperation that medical emergency in the context of financial limitation produces. The show treats this honestly enough to let you see the horror underneath the comedy. Homer's life is contingent on what the family can pay, and what the family can pay is not sufficient for competent care, and the gap between what Homer needs and what the family can afford is bridged by a man whose qualifications are a running joke. This is funny until it is true, and then it is true and funny at the same time, and the coexistence of the truth and the funny is the show's most accurate representation of what the specific experience of economic precarity in a medical context actually feels like from inside. Marge's Sun Poisoning Season 17, Episode 9. This is a later season episode, which means it carries the burden of comparison to the golden era, and that comparison tends to obscure what the episode is actually doing. It is an episode about the specific phase of a mother-son relationship when the son is beginning to separate, when the easy physical affection of childhood is becoming something that requires negotiation, when the mother's instinct toward closeness encounters the son's developing need for a distance that she has not yet fully understood how to provide without experiencing as rejection. Marge and Bart's bond over a tea room is the episode's comedic premise. The comedy is gentle and occasionally warm. But the thing underneath the comedy is Marge's specific sadness about Bart growing up, rendered in the particular way that the show renders things when it is being honest about parenting, not as drama, not as sentiment, but as a series of small moments in which the change is visible before it has been named, in which you see the mother seeing the son becoming someone she will have to learn new ways of loving. The show has always been better at this register, at the quiet observation of what it is to love someone who is becoming different from who they were, than it gets credit for being. This episode is one of the clearer examples from the later seasons of the show, still being capable of the thing it was always best at. Behind the Laughter Season 11, Episode 22, this mockumentary episode, which presents the Simpson family as actual people who play fictional versions of themselves on a television show, is at once one of the most formally clever things the show ever attempted and one of its most genuinely dark pieces of self-reflection. The episode depicts the rise and decline of the fictional Simpsons as a show within a show, tracing the arc from initial success through creative exhaustion, through personal and professional crisis, through eventual, if precarious, recovery. The arc maps recognizably onto the show's actual history, filtered through the exaggerations of the mockumentary format. But what the episode does that is genuinely unusual is to take the characters seriously as people who have been producing a version of themselves for public consumption for an extended period, and to examine what that production costs. Homer, Marge, Bart, and Lisa are all depicted as people who have spent years performing simplified versions of themselves, and who have been changed by the performance in ways that are not uniformly comfortable. The performing self and the actual self have not remained cleanly distinct. The show Homer and the actual Homer have bled into each other in ways that make both versions less complete than they might have been separately. This is a sophisticated piece of meta-commentary for a primetime animated show to attempt, and the episode does it while maintaining the comedy that the format requires, which is one of the more impressive tonal balancing acts in the show's long history. It is also, when you hold it against the backdrop of the theories we have been exploring, a strikingly honest acknowledgement that the show has always known it was doing something more complicated than being a sitcom about a cartoon family. Section 20. The language of the show. The Simpsons developed a language across its first 8 or 9 seasons that became so embedded in American cultural expression that people who have never watched the show use phrases and constructions that originated in it without knowing their origin. Do is in the dictionary. Various other Simpsons coinages and quotes have become part of the informal lexicon of American English, available to anyone regardless of their relationship to the show. This linguistic legacy is part of the show's cultural footprint, and it is worth noting in passing before moving on to a more specific observation about the show's language. The specific observation is this: the show speaks differently when it is being dark. Not dramatically differently, not in a way that announces itself as a tonal shift, because the show's most consistent formal achievement is the way it moves between registers without announcing the movement. But there is a difference. When the show is in its comedy-only mode, the language is faster, more densely packed, more reliant on rhythm and timing and the specific precision of the joke. When the show is doing the second thing, the darker thing, the language slows. The sentences become simpler. The pauses become more significant. The silence within a scene carries more weight. You can hear this in the voice performances. Dan Castellaneta's Homer has at least 2 distinct vocal modes. The comedy Homer, fast and reactive and built for the rhythm of the joke, and the serious Homer, slower, more uncertain, with a quality in the voice that is neither completely acting nor completely unguarded, somewhere between the two, in the specific register where a professional comedian demonstrates that they can do something else when the material calls for it. The same is true of Julie Kavner's Marge, whose voice is one of the most recognizable in American animation, and whose range within that voice is more substantial than it is usually given credit for. The comedy Marge is one thing. The Marge of the quiet late-night conversation, or the moment of genuine fear, or the accumulated weariness breaking through the patience is something different, rendered in the same voice but with a quality that the comedy Marge does not need and the serious Marge cannot do without. The show's language, in both its spoken and its visual dimensions, shifts when the subject shifts. And the shift, when you know to listen for it, is one of the signals that the show is about to do the thing it is most interesting when it does. When the rhythm slows and the pauses open and the voice performances drop out of comedy mode and into something quieter and more honest, you know you are in the second story register. You know the show is about to show you something real. The grammar of Homer's love. Homer Simpson does not express love in the grammatical forms that are most socially recognized as love. He does not say the right things at the right times. He does not demonstrate attentiveness or foresight or the specific care for the other person's experience that conventional romantic language requires. He frequently does the wrong thing, says the wrong thing, prioritizes the wrong things. He is, by any conventional metric of romantic partnership, an imperfect husband. But the show has always known that Homer loves Marge in a way that is real even when it is expressed badly, that the love is present in him constantly even when his expression of it is comically inadequate. And the specific moments when the grammar of Homer's love becomes legible, when the love surfaces in a form that can be seen and heard and understood without requiring translation or generosity of interpretation, these are some of the most genuinely moving moments in the show's history. The moment in And Maggie Makes Three, when Homer looks at the photographs at the end and the meaning of what he did becomes clear. The moment in Mother Simpson when Homer and Mona sit in the kitchen together and the audience sees, in the quality of Homer's attention to his mother, the shape of the longing that has been running through his life since childhood. The moment in Bart Gets an F when Homer's disappointment in Bart's grade is revealed to be inseparable from his love for Bart, from his specific hope for Bart's future that he cannot articulate but that is entirely real. These moments speak in the grammar that Homer can manage, which is not always the grammar of words but is reliably the grammar of presence, of the specific quality of attention that love produces when it is genuine. Homer is not good at saying what he means. He is, in his specific way, very good at being there. And in the show's best moments, being there is what love looks like. The grammar of Marge's patience. Marge's patience is the structural support of the show. It is what makes everything else possible. Without Marge's patience, Homer's disasters produce consequences rather than comedy. The children's difficulties produce crises rather than episodes. The marriage produces collapse rather than continuation. Marge's patience is the show's load-bearing wall. And the show has been honest, in the spaces between the comedy, about what that load costs her. Not dramatically honest. Not in the mode of a show that makes the cost the subject of the episode, but quietly honest, in the specific way that the show is quiet when it is being honest, in the pauses and the faces and the moments when the grammar of Marge's patience becomes legible as something other than infinite resource. There is a grammar to Marge's patience that is different from the grammar of effortless patience, of patience that is native and costs nothing. Marge's patience is effortful. You can see the effort in the moments when the comedy pauses long enough to let you see it. The breath she takes before responding to Homer. The specific quality of her silence when the silence is the thing she has chosen over what she might otherwise say. The way her face looks when she is holding something that she is not for the moment going to say out loud. The grammar of Marge's patience is the grammar of a person who could say the difficult thing and has decided, for reasons the show does not always explain, not to. Who could ask for more than she is getting and has decided, repeatedly, across 36 years of episodes, to ask for exactly what the situation can currently provide? Who loves Homer not in spite of his limitations but in full awareness of them, choosing the love that the real Homer generates rather than holding out for the love that a better version of Homer might generate? This is an unusual kind of love to build a show around. It is not the love of romantic comedy, which requires obstacles rather than accommodation. It is the love of a long marriage, which requires the specific willingness to choose, every day and in every episode, the actual person rather than the hypothetical improved version. Marge makes this choice so consistently that it becomes invisible within the comedy. But in the dark and the quiet, when the comedy is not covering it, the choice is visible. And the choice, repeated across 36 years, is the most sustained act of love in the show's history. Section 21, the show that knew what it was. The Simpsons has always known what it was. Not in the sense that it always operated at the level of its best work, because it did not, and the decline from the peak seasons is real, and the late season episodes that fail to sustain the tone of the early work are genuinely less good. But in the sense that the show never lost awareness of the thing it was doing underneath the comedy, the honest account of ordinary life that the comedy was holding. The episodes that are most clearly aware of this tend to be the ones that step outside the show's normal narrative mode and address the viewer directly or semi-directly, the episodes that wink at the frame and acknowledge that what is happening here is a production, a made thing, a specific form of art attempting a specific form of communication. These meta-episodes are among the show's most formally interesting work, and they are also, often, its most revealing. Homer versus Paternity Caper, the direct address moments. The show has occasionally stepped outside its frame to address the audience directly, not in the breaking the fourth wall mode of comedy, but in a more ambiguous mode, where the character seems momentarily aware that they are in a television show and finds this knowledge useful rather than alarming. Homer has done this most frequently, which makes sense given that Homer is the show's most frequent vehicle for the kind of awareness that is not quite competence, but that is, occasionally, more than it looks like. There is something in the Homer knows he is in a show moments that is more than a meta-joke. It is the show using Homer's specific cognitive style, his imprecise but sometimes surprisingly accurate relationship to the world, to access a register of awareness that the show's normal realism does not accommodate. When Homer knows he is in a television show, the show is acknowledging that what is happening is a performance, a production, a thing made to be watched. And in making that acknowledgement, the show is also acknowledging the viewer, recognizing the specific presence of the person on the other side of the screen who has chosen to spend time with this particular fiction. The acknowledgement is brief, usually, and covered quickly by the next joke. But it is there. The show sees you. It has always seen you. The clip shows as honest autobiography. The clip shows, episodes structured around the revisitation of footage from previous episodes, are generally regarded as the show's least interesting formal mode. They are economical, using existing material rather than producing new material, and they tend to be deployed when the production needs to save resources or fill schedule. They are not in critical consensus where the show does its best work. But there is something worth noting about the clip shows that this consensus tends to obscure. The clip shows are the episodes where the show is most explicitly in conversation with its own history, where the accumulated archive of everything that has happened in Springfield is acknowledged as an archive, as a record, as the accumulation that 36 years of weekly production produces. The clip shows are where the show reflects on itself most directly, and in the reflection, something of the show's actual nature becomes visible. The relationships between characters are summarized differently in clip shows than in regular episodes. The texture of the history is different. You can see, in the selection of moments that the clip show's narrative frame chooses to revisit, what the show believes is essential about itself, what it regards as worth returning to, what it considers central to the account it has been giving. And what the clip shows consistently return to is not the comedy. They return to the love, the Homer and Marge moments, the parent and child moments, the moments of genuine connection between people who are imperfect and who love each other anyway. The comedy is available in the archive too, and the clip shows use it, but the emotional architecture of the clip shows is built from the moments where the love was visible, where the warmth broke through the comedy, where the second story surfaced briefly before being covered over again. This is the show telling you what it believes it has been about, not the jokes, the love, the imperfect, persistent, repeatedly tested love of a family that keeps choosing each other. The clip shows are the show's occasional confession that, underneath everything else, that is what it has always been. Number, Section 22. The last 20 minutes in Springfield. We have been here for a long time now. We have walked through the rooms of Springfield's darkness. The rooms it keeps locked and the rooms it leaves open, and the rooms that appear without warning in the middle of what looked like a comedy. We have read the second story. We have heard what the spaces between the jokes were holding. What remains, in these last few minutes together, is not a conclusion exactly. Springfield does not permit conclusions. The loop does not end. The family does not arrive at a resting place that would justify calling it concluded. What remains is simply the view from where we are standing, after everything we have seen, looking at what the show has built over 36 years and trying to understand what that building amounts to. What the dark episodes give you. The dark episodes of The Simpsons give you something specific that the comedy episodes do not give, and that the dramatic episodes of prestige television do not give either. They give you the experience of truth that has been made bearable by the form it was put in. They give you the experience of being shown something real without being asked to suffer through the showing, the comedy doing enough protective work that the truth can be encountered without requiring the specific defenses that truth often demands. This is what comedy has always been for, at its most serious. Not to make difficult things funny, which would diminish them, but to make difficult things approachable, to create enough of a gap between the viewer and the subject that the viewer can look at the subject clearly enough to see it, without the immediacy of the subject's difficulty overwhelming the capacity to see. The Simpsons has been doing this for 36 years, making the difficulty of ordinary life approachable, making the specific sadnesses and frustrations and imperfections of the particular American life it depicts visible without making them unbearable, holding the darkness and the warmth in the same frame, week after week, and trusting the audience to know that both are real and that neither cancels the other. What Homer would say, Homer Simpson, if he could understand clearly what we have been doing for the last 4 hours, if the crayon were removed and the intelligence restored and the full picture of his own situation were available to him, would probably say something clumsy and imprecise that managed, despite its clumsiness, to be exactly right. He would probably say something about family, about the specific value of having people who are there when the alternative is not having them, regardless of the particular imperfections of the arrangement. He would say it badly, and with a timing that missed slightly, and with a grammatical structure that could have been improved, and Marge would fix it with a look, and Bart would say something dismissive, and Lisa would explain what Homer meant more clearly than Homer said it, and Maggie would watch all of this from the corner with her enormous eyes and her perfect silence, storing it, understanding it in the way she understands everything, completely. And then the couch gag would play, and the episode would start, and Springfield would be exactly as it always was, and the loop would continue, and nobody would age, and the darkness would be present in the spaces between the comedy, as it has always been present, and the warmth would be present too, as it has always been present, and the family would survive another episode by the simple expedient of not stopping, of continuing, of choosing each other again by default and by intention, in approximately equal measure. This is the show. This has always been the show. Under the yellow skin and the 4 fingers and the cracked cooling towers and the billionaire who glows in the dark and the town that exists on no map and the children who have been 10 and 8 and 1 for 36 years, under all of it, the same family in the same house on Evergreen Terrace, in the town that is everywhere and nowhere, in the loop that does not end. What the darkness means. The darkness of The Simpsons means that the show took its subject seriously, that it knew, behind the comedy and through the comedy, what the life it was depicting actually cost and what it actually provided. That it did not simplify the Simpson family into the functional family of conventional television comedy, where the difficulties are overcome and the lessons are learned, and the episode ends with the appropriate sentiment in the appropriate place. That it kept the difficulty visible, kept the imperfection intact, kept the truth of the thing running underneath the joke. The darkness means the show respected its audience, believed that the audience could hold both the comedy and the truth at the same time without needing one to overcome the other, trusted that the viewer in front of the television at 8 o'clock on a Sunday night or at 4 in the morning in the dark was capable of seeing a family that was real in all its imperfection and loving it anyway, the way you love real things that are imperfect, which is the only way there is to love real things. The darkness means the show was honest, in the way that great art is honest, not by telling you things you did not know, but by telling you things you knew and had not quite found the language for, in a form that the language and the image and the sound could carry, in the specific and irreplaceable form of this particular show, about this particular family in this particular town, across this particular span of years. The darkness means The Simpsons loved Springfield, loved the family, loved the imperfect life it was depicting, in the specific way that you love something when you are willing to see it clearly, when you do not need to improve it or resolve it or make it into something more comfortable before you can regard it with warmth. That is what the darkness means. It means the show loved its subject enough to be honest about it. And the love and the honesty together, across 36 years and 800 episodes, and the specific accumulated weight of all of it, is the thing that has kept us here. Going to sleep in Springfield? You are going to sleep in Springfield tonight. Or you already have, somewhere in the middle of Burns's immortality or Ned Flanders's quiet sadness, or the floating timeline, or the 4 in the morning quality of late-season honesty. Springfield is good for sleeping. It was always good for sleeping. The loop will continue while you sleep. Homer will go to work and come home. Marge will hold the house together. Bart will find trouble and escape consequence. Lisa will play her saxophone in the room that is only hers. Maggie will watch everything from behind her pacifier, storing it, understanding it, waiting. Burns will receive his weekly treatment and glow briefly in the dark. Smithers will maintain the schedule. The plant will operate without the safety oversight that safety requires. The water will contain what it always has. The fish will have 3 eyes and no one will ask why. The town will forget what it has always forgotten. The principal who is not the principal will sign another day's paperwork. The judge will enforce the decree against truth. The real Seymour Skinner will remain wherever he is, exiled from a life that was always his, in a town that made his honesty illegal. The loop continues. Springfield endures. The family remains. And wherever you are tonight, whatever time it is there, whatever corner of the world you are watching from, the Springfield that is everywhere and nowhere is where you have been spending the last 4 hours. In its corridors and its rooms and its darker spaces, the places the comedy usually moves you through too quickly to see clearly. You saw them tonight. You saw what the show was holding. The imperfect love and the honest darkness, and the family that keeps choosing each other, and the town that will not let them go, and the audience that will not let the town go, and the loop that continues for all of us, together, in the specific community of people who have loved this show imperfectly and persistently for more years than we can quite account for. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. That is the whole point. Number. Section 23. The characters we never got enough of. The Simpsons has always had a cast problem in the best possible sense. Too many interesting people, not enough episodes, and a format that consistently required the main family to anchor the story, which meant the side characters orbited the center without ever quite getting the gravitational pull they deserved. The characters we never got enough of are not minor in any real sense. They are minor only in the sense that the show's format made them minor, pushed them to the periphery, used them in service of the central family story when they had, barely visible in the margins, stories of their own that the show gestured toward and then moved away from. Sideshow Bob after the villain. Sideshow Bob is one of the show's most sustained achievements. A recurring antagonist played with a specific quality of theatrical menace by Kelsey Grammer that elevates every episode he appears in. The Bob episodes are beloved, well-regarded, and have produced some of the show's most formally elegant comedy. The Sideshow Bob episodes are not the undiscovered territory. They are thoroughly known. But there is a version of Sideshow Bob that the comedy format prevented the show from exploring, the version that exists in the spaces between the theatrical villainy and the repeated thwarted plans. The version that is not a vehicle for comedy but a person who has spent his adult life in an escalating conflict with a 10-year-old child, each cycle of the conflict adding another layer to the fixation until the fixation has consumed everything else the person might have been. Robert Underdunk Terwilliger Jr. had an intelligence that the show consistently established as genuine and significant, a classical education and aesthetic sensibility, and a capacity for long-term planning and elaborate execution that was consistently defeated by the specific counterforce of Bart's impulsive brilliance and Springfield's general resistance to his schemes. In a different world, with a different antagonist, he might have been a genuinely dangerous presence. In Springfield, he is comic. His intelligence is defeated not because it is insufficient, but because the specific form of its insufficiency, its inability to account for chaos, for the imprecision and the randomness and the Bartness of the opposition, is the engine of the comedy. The dark version of Bob, the version the show occasionally showed and then moved away from, is the version who knows this about himself. Who understands that the fixation has become the definition, that the person who existed before the conflict with Bart is no longer accessible, that the intelligence and the education and the ambition have all been redirected into a loop that has no exit because the loop is what the character has become. This version of Bob is not comic. He is tragic in the specific way that people who were capable of more than they became are tragic. And the show gave you enough of him to see it while never quite committing to a full examination. Edna Krabappel after Bart? Edna Krabappel taught Bart Simpson's class for the show's entire run, until Marcia Wallace's death in 2013 ended the character's active presence in Springfield. She was sardonic and tired and fond of cigarettes, and frequently resigned to the gap between what teaching was supposed to be and what it actually was in Springfield's particular educational environment. But Edna had a romantic life that the show visited periodically, and what those visits revealed was a person who wanted connection in a context that made connection difficult. She dated Principal Skinner for extended stretches, the relationship producing a specific comedy of two people who were too known to each other to be romantic in the way that romance requires some quality of mystery. She had other relationships that the show depicted with varying degrees of sympathy and comedy. The dark thing in Edna's situation, the thing that made the sardonic presentation and the cigarettes make sense as adaptations, was the gap between what she had hoped her life would look like and what it actually looked like. She had chosen a vocation, and the vocation had not produced the satisfactions that vocations are supposed to produce. She had sought connection, and the connection had been imperfect and temporary and ultimately insufficient. She had maintained her position in Springfield's educational system through decades of a job that was specifically unrewarding in the way that teaching Bart Simpson's class was always going to be unrewarding. She persisted. She adapted. She became the sardonic version of herself that the adaptation produced. And the sardonic version was genuinely funny, and the comedy of the sardonic Edna was real and earned. But underneath the sardonic surface was the original person who had expected something different, and the distance between the original expectation and the actual life was the dark space that the comedy lived above. Sideshow Mel as the forgotten one. Sideshow Mel, the blue-haired entertainer who replaced Bob as Krusty's sidekick, exists primarily as a running gag. He has a bone through his hair. He speaks in melodramatic theatrical cadences. He appears in crowd scenes and background moments, and occasionally has a line that the episode needed a side character to deliver. But Mel's situation, when you pause to consider it, is genuinely strange. He replaced a man who tried to frame Krusty for robbery and then, in subsequent seasons, repeatedly attempted to murder a child. He took over a role that was defined by its previous occupant's villainy, and has held it, presumably with full knowledge of that history, for the entirety of the show's run. He is, by default and by circumstance, the Krusty show's longest-serving sidekick, having outlasted the man whose shadow he was always going to live in. There is something worth noting in Mel's persistent presence. His continued occupation of a role that was never designed to be permanent, that was always going to be measured against the theatrical brilliance and the spectacular failure of the person who held it first. He is the placeholder who became the fixture, the temporary solution who became the permanent arrangement, and the show has never quite decided whether to treat him as a person or as a prop, which means he exists in the uncomfortable middle ground, visible enough to notice but not prominent enough to receive the attention that would make the noticing meaningful. Groundskeeper Willie's ongoing exile. Willie is from Scotland. He has been in Springfield long enough that it is no longer clear whether Scotland is home or memory or simply a reference point for a self that was formed somewhere else and has never quite reformed around the Springfield context. He tends the school grounds with a dedication that the school does not reciprocate. He lives in a small shack on school property. He exists in conditions of material poverty that the show occasionally makes explicit and then moves away from. The dark thing about Willie is not his poverty or his isolation or his specific comedic function as the explosive-tempered groundskeeper who is more emotionally volatile than the situation usually warrants. It is the combination of these things, a person who is competent at his work, who takes his function seriously, who has remained in his position through decades of Springfield's institutional chaos, and who has received in return for this competence and this persistence a material situation that represents the specific reward structure of work that is essential and undervalued. Willie does what needs to be done. The school grounds are maintained because Willie maintains them. The snow is removed because Willie removes it. The various crises that require his specific skills are managed because Willie manages them. And Willie lives in a shack on school property and has no evident social life outside his function and is encountered by the main characters primarily when his function intersects with their stories. He is the person whose labor is visible only when it fails, who is noticed only when the thing he maintains requires attention, who has built a life in the margins of other people's more prominent stories. The comedy of his volcanic temperament is real, and the temperament makes sense as the adaptation of a person who has spent decades in precisely these conditions. But the comedy does not replace the honest acknowledgement of what the conditions are and what they produce. Number. Section 24. The long ending. We have been ending for a while now. The script has been building toward its ending across several sections, each one attempting to be the last thing before the silence, each one finding that there was still something left to say. This is appropriate for a show about a family that does not end, that keeps going, that finds when each episode concludes that there is another episode, and another, and another, the loop running across 36 years, without the terminal moment that would convert it from a loop into a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. The show's long ending is our long ending too. The show cannot conclude because we have not allowed it to conclude. We keep watching. We keep showing up. We keep pressing play, and the family assembles on the couch, and the episode begins. And Springfield is exactly as we left it, unchanged by anything that has happened in the world outside it, ready to receive us again as it has always been ready, as it will continue to be ready for as long as there is an audience to receive it. This is the relationship. The show keeps going and we keep watching, and the family stays frozen, and the town stays frozen, and the couch is always there, and the light is always on, and Maggie is always 1 year old, and Bart is always 10, and Lisa is always 8, and Homer is always in his mid-30s, and Marge is always in her mid-30s, and Burns is always ancient, and Smithers is always devoted, and the plant is always cracked, and the water is always poisoned, and nobody is asking why. We are the audience for this. We chose this. We are still choosing it. And in the choosing, we are doing the same thing the show is doing. Maintaining the loop not because we cannot see it clearly, but because seeing it clearly and choosing it anyway is the specific form of love that long relationships produce. The love that knows the imperfection and stays. The love that has seen the darkness and sits with it. The love that chooses the actual thing over the improved hypothetical thing, because the actual thing is what is here, what is real, what has been here through all the years of the relationship. We love The Simpsons the way Homer loves Marge. Not because it is perfect, because it is there. Because it has always been there. Because the version of ourselves that first sat down to watch it is still alive in the watching, still present in the specific warmth that the opening music produces and the couch gag provides, and the first sight of Springfield in its impossible geography generates. We are not the people we were when we started watching, but watching the show, we can almost remember being them. We can hold them for 22 minutes in the company of a family that has not changed, in a town that has not changed, in the light of something that has been constant across all the years that we have not been. That is what the show gives you, finally, after the comedy and the darkness and the honest account and the imperfect love and everything else. It gives you the specific comfort of something that was there before and is still there now, that will be there next week, that has survived everything the world has done in the years between your first encounter with it and your most recent one. Springfield endures, the family endures, the loop endures, and you are part of it. You have always been part of it. Every time you pressed play, you became part of the loop, part of the mechanism that keeps Springfield frozen and the family young, and the couch always there, and the light always on. You are Springfield's audience. You are what keeps it going. And tonight, in the dark, in the quiet, having seen what the show has been holding behind the comedy for 36 years, you can let that be enough. The loop continues. You can sleep. Springfield will be here when you wake up. It always is. Drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is. Subscribe for more nights like this one. Good night from Springfield.